Hey everyone, Nyx here. This is a 3-hour compilation of all my WoW housing projects so far, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. This will be a series following my journey with housing, but before we can get into that, there's a lot of decor that I need to collect. While we collect this decor though, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and also my plans for my house. If you used to follow me for my Overwatch videos, you might have noticed some changes in the name and the voice and just generally on the whole. It's been an interesting almost 10 years at this point, but if you're new to the channel, hi, I'm Nyx. I'm a girl who really likes World of Warcraft. I've been playing for about 8 years now. I started in Legion, and there's been some ups and downs, Shadowlands, to really name the big one, but it's always been my home game that I've come back to, and now it really can be my home game in a whole new way. I'm also, or I at least used to be, a big Minecraft player, and I do art. Here's some of my art. Essentially, creativity is a major part of my life. I express some of that in WoW already through roleplay with a variety of characters, and housing is going to give me the opportunity to express that in an even more dynamic way, so I'm very excited to get started. My goals for my house are to make a home for all of my characters. And each of my characters has stories, themes, vibes, directions that I want to be able to express through my house in its own way, and since we only have 2 houses, tie it all together. I'm mostly a Horde player, but I've got my fair share of Alliance characters as well. My Rogue in particular I've mained for ages, though my true main is my Monk. But my Monk is one of many characters, and since they're all from different themes, I've got to mesh them together. I've got Blood Elves, Noble and Peasantry. I've got a whole host of Forsaken, and I've got the classic Horde that scream Loktar Ogar as they charge into battle. And all of these have to share one house. So what I've come up with is inspired by speakeasies, by Piltover and Zorn from Arcane, by the general vibe of a squeaky clean exterior to mask a shady underbelly. The front of the house, the yard, and then the entry rooms are going to be this extravagant elven style inn or enclave that you walk in, and it all seems on the up and up at first. Then, as you head into the back rooms, it becomes clear there's a little shady dealing going on. And if you get into the real back rooms, you find a Forsaken section with an underground tavern with rooms for each of my Forsaken characters branching off of it. You'll also find a Horde fighting pit with rooms for my Horde characters, and all of this centered around this elven front where my elven characters live. That's my plan for my house. It's going to be interesting to build with the limits to room and decor budget, but I'm very excited to get to work, and today we're going to get started right away with an exterior. I'm part of a guild where you all roleplay, and I want to make sure that they have something nice up front to look at as they're flying around the neighborhood. Okay, that took about 2 or 3 hours logging across a bunch of different alts, flying around to all the vendors I can buy vendors from, and then doing similar on Alliance. That's a good 8 years of playing and a lot of grinding of different expansions and stuff for housing and preparation, all right there, but I'm finally done and I'm ready to get started on building. The first thing I'm going to do is cover this orcish exterior. I love the orc vibes, but it just doesn't really fit what I'm going for with this house. And as much as I'd love to go right out the gate with this extravagant Blood Elf manor, we don't have access to Blood Elf housing yet, so I'm going to need to get a little creative. What I first decided to do was cover the exterior in rocks. This is a pretty common technique I've seen online. The benefits of this plot is that I can put the house right up against the cliff face and make it look like a cave built into the mountains. So using rocks and then later trees to cover the areas where the rocks can't go because they're outside the plot, but the tree branches extend, I'm able to cover up the orc house. I also decided to get some monk representation in there because my main is a monk And while she's not the owner of the house, well, she's a messy undead girl who grew up on Murder Row and has never really had much to call her own, she is still a monk, and that still matters to me. So I used this piece from the monk order hall and the light well that you get from pre-ordering Midnight, as well as some rocks, to create this nice little monk shrine where she can go to meditate, or I can invite guildies over to have monk training sessions or do meditation in that sense. But that left me with a problem. I now spent about half my decor budget, maybe even a little bit more, on just surrounding the house with a facade. And it looked great, but the rest of the plot felt very empty, and because this plot is very open, that really stood out. I then turned to the rest of the plot, and I began working out how to fill all this empty space with a now budget that had been limited by rocks and trees. And as I was doing that, I came to the realization that the elven pagoda you get for pre-ordering Midnight is actually perfect for building an elven entrance. So I ended up moving that over there, and then everything just started coming together. I used the Sindori sleepers, which are beds, but have this perfect sheer red curtain look to make a door and cover up the orc door, which I later would cover with a carpet anyway, but it further made it look like an actual elven entrance. With this alone, I already had the sense of an elven enclave that then goes inside the mountains almost as a fortress, which does sort of fit the vibes of this being a more shady establishment ultimately. So what I did next was try to fill that space. I wanted to make the plot, because it is meant to be this fancy Blood Elven manor, feel a little bit more enclosed, feel a little bit more private. So the first thing I did was use trees to create a sort of grove. This further heightened the enclave feel, and it helped make it feel like things are more enclosed in, because the shadow created a sort of boundary for the plot. But that still left me with a lot of empty space. Initially, I was trying to fill the edge with a fountain, but I realized that works great for a centerpiece. Again, if we're going for this noble style, a fountain in the garden just makes sense. It sort of stood on its own, but we're going to get to that later. First, we had to deal with all this empty space on the edge of the plot. Unfortunately, because of the way the borders of this plot works, I actually can't place objects too far out to the edge. There are some objects that I have in mind that might look great here, like a Blood Elf statue, but those aren't coming to Midnight. And furthermore, I want my garden to be somewhere that I can use as a roleplay space. So, inspired by a quick visit to Surima to get some decor, I put down a carpet, I set up some chairs, and I made a little tea spot, which also makes great use of the view of this place where you can see 4 beautiful waterfalls. It looks more like 3, but the zone name is 4 Sisters and one of the waterfalls splits, so I guess it's 4. I also decided to put a telescope there because the benefits of this being a more open plot means you have a great view of the beautiful night sky, and you could also use it to look at the waterfalls. While I would like to fill this space more, decor limits being what they are, I decided to just leave it at this for now. Then I returned to the fountain. When objects stand alone in housing, I found, it can often be very jarring. In real life, it's very rare that you'll find an object that's just standing totally freestanding with nothing else touching it. That's reserved for display pieces, which fountains are, but a fountain just surrounded by grass just looks like it's sitting there. There's not attention being brought to it. So what I did was use these Surima stepping stones. This had a double purpose of setting the fountain within the garden, since it is a Surima fountain, and also giving a nice path through the garden that leads to the front door and then to the back section where you can descend to the lakeside. This really helped tie everything together, I feel, and by sinking the tiles into the ground at such a high scale, it made for a really nice eye-catching pattern on the floor. I also gave it this sort of swirling look, which further accentuates that natural elven feel. With that all done, I only had a few pieces of decor budget left to fill, and there were just a few things missing. I cleaned up some of the rocks in the back of the plot that were no longer necessary to give it this hidden feel with the trees that I've implemented, and that gave me enough room to then take more of these Silvermoon shrubs, which I'd already been using on the rocky exterior, and place them around the edges of the trees. Again, an object freestanding works fine, but it works a little bit better if it's actually touching something in the plot. It makes it feel more integrated and, especially with greenery, more alive. Around trees and around edges is where gardens get tended to less thoroughly. What they also do is help make the garden feel, again, a little bit more private. There's no hedge fence, and frankly, I don't really want there to be a hedge fence. I want this to be a more welcome, natural environment, the one that feels very closed off and rigid. This is a place not just for fancy elven nobles to visit, but for shady sorts to be able to wander in and head up to the back rooms. But these bushes really helped tie everything together, and they match the Ajaran landscape wonderfully. Furthermore, I think that using a limited selection of plant life within your plot works wonders for creating a cohesive look. I really only have these trees and these bushes in the plot, and while there are others that fit well, by just having these two, it feels more natural and more cohesive. All the elements come together. The rocky facade of the house becomes tied with the garden, and furthermore, in real life, you're only going to get so many kinds of plants in the area unless you're bringing other plants in and planting them intentionally, which takes away from this more natural, elegant feel. With all of this put together, I finally had an exterior done that I was happy with, and I think it turned out really great. When Blood Elf housing gets added with the release of Midnight, I will almost certainly be revisiting this, although a lot of elements like the monk shrine and some of the stuff out in the gardens like the cafe are probably gonna stay, because I just liked how they turned out. But for now, this will do, and I think makes a great welcoming entrance to this Blood Elven inn. It's time to get inside. I've got this Blood Elf exterior built into this cave here, and I've talked a little about the interior structure and what my plans are for that, but we're going to get in more depth here today and get started on one of the rooms. I've stripped the interior entirely, and what we're going to do is we're going to edit the floor plan. I posted a placeholder floor plan in the last episode, and much of it is going to stay the same. We're going to start off with this octagon room. This will be essentially the main Blood Elf front. If you didn't catch the last episode, the idea is a very fancy, elegant Blood Elf front ran by this matron by the name of Lady Serenray Brightblaze. She is essentially a Blood Elf noblewoman who makes a lot of shady deals, and that's why in the back of her house she has rooms for Horde and Forsaken, which both deal in a little more criminal dealings. That's the goal, and today we're going to get started with that Forsaken room, because my guild is Forsaken oriented, and I want to kick us off with a place to roleplay. Plus, I've got a ton of ideas, and I'm really wanting to just jump right into it. This octagon room is going to lead into a empty stairwell room. Empty stairwell rooms, in my opinion, are the ultimate housing cheat. They cost the same as a small square room, while being the exact same size and having 2 floors. So if you're willing to play around with platforms and interesting housing structures as well as staircases, you can actually get double the budget on your rooms essentially, and it allows you to fill out the space a lot more. So we're going to be stacking a lot of stairwell rooms together. It's going to be another stairwell room up here. This will be for my Death Knight and my Warlock on the bottom, Death Knight on top. And then this room, because my main gets special privileges, is going to be an octagon room small. Just a room off to the side that I'm going to turn into a cave. This will be our beginning room. And then later, when we come back to revisit this room, we can decide if we want to extend the Horde section out like this, for example, or if we want to put it up there and then we'll just have to cover up these walls. It depends on what I ultimately end up doing for my stair technology. But that gives us a start here. Let's go ahead and start putting in the basic customization. We won't finish all of this stuff today, but just having the specific styles is really going to help out a lot with making it feel like it's sort of aligned with everything else. that is all the easy stuff out of the way. We've got basic rooms set up, ready to be filled with stuff. Now it's just a matter of finding stuff to fill it with. But before I'm able to do that, I need to actually go out and grab some decor. Alrighty, so I went and grabbed a ton of decor, and I'm now ready to get started building. I'll probably have to grab more. I think what I'm going to do is structural stuff first, get the upper balcony going so that we can have that, and then we'll get to the stage. Been hard at work with the infrastructure, and I've got a basic layout now, I think. Got the stage down there, which I think has turned out really nicely and is going to look even better once I put instruments on, and then a balcony up here. I'm going to see if I can squeeze in some tables, places people could sit and drink without it getting too cluttered, though with how narrow a space that is, it might be a little interesting. We've also got these custom stairs that I really like the look of. They are fully functional. You can just go up and down them. Sometimes you get like caught a little bit, but usually it's just for a little bit and then your character adjusts over to the side. These are the undermined shelves, and because they have this metal that's sticking down to the side, you can connect one stair to another and really make this great look of the stairs actually being supported and all in sequence with each other. It also fits well with the other metal elements and the green tones that are already present in the build, and it looks exactly like the sort of dinky stair that you'd see at a club that maybe has a few health code violations. I think it works out great. I also think that the way I ended up doing the balcony ultimately worked out well. These are just Orgrimmar pillars, and because they're so rickety, you can see that there are gaps through them that further adds to this sort of like rundown, ramshackle vibe. For a while, the fences were just sitting in such a way that they were fully flush with this. Inside, not clipped out, you didn't have this overhang. And what that did was it made the upstairs area feel a lot smaller for one, but it also made this edge of these beams feel just very exposed. I knew I'd have to find some way to hide them, but then I bumped the fences out, and now the fences themselves can add more interest to this otherwise very flat surface. It looks great. It also let me use these pillars to create this sort of rising pillar here to then give it some support. What's next, now that we've got this stage set up and stairs and the balcony and just the general basic layout of this, is it's time to build the bar. Okay, so I've got most of the structure done in a way that I like. The bar is set up nicely. There's a little door to get back to it over here that you use under the stairs. And I really like these shelves. They're going to be dyed, but they make this secret hidden bookshelf blend in really well to what will eventually lead to my Forsaken sort of apothecary warlock's hidden laboratory. I went to a roleplay event last night with my guild, and it's a new day today, but while I was at that event, I had a ton of ideas for details. You can see I already started testing some stuff, but I'm now ready to get in and get into the minor stuff, further accentuating it, getting some tables in here, and all around just making the place feel more alive and lived in. I think I'm fairly happy with all of the details we got in so far. We've got chairs about, we've got stools that you can actually sit in. These are two stools stacked on top of each other even to get that proper height. We've got the bar back here, has all of this stuff stocked up. I want to get more of the alchemy specific bottles and sort of potion sets and put them back here as well to further add to that look. But we're still in early housing days and professions are currently very expensive and very time consuming, so I'm saving that for now. These rugs are supposed to be like chalkboards almost. I also made a private room booth seat because this is supposed to be a space for roleplay, and I feel like having roleplays back here where people are sitting around this table, making shady dealings, having private access to the bar is going to be really, really good. Upstairs, similarly, is filled out, although it's a little less complicated, just a bunch of seats to further add to the vibe that this is a tavern. I think it all just comes together really nice, especially now that there's some lighting in there, lending it this atmospheric green feel. But there is something that I want to do on the ceiling. Currently, this area is very plain. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. Not every inch of space needs to be covered with something, of course. In fact, it would look kind of off. But I want to try and do a sort of fancy chandelier situation. Not quite chandelier, more like a neon light symbol type of thing. We'll see if it works out. I might just hang some lanterns instead. As much as I like how this is turning out, having this cool symbol up there, I think I'm gonna go for the hanging lanterns idea instead. Because this is very flat, it doesn't do a lot to fill out this space so much, and on top of that, this is like 60 budget, and this room is already up to about 400 budget. So this alone greatly inflates that in a way that is going to bite me later as I get to more rooms. We're already at such a huge point on the budget, and I've got like 8 or so more rooms to do when we already have spent about a fifth of our budget just on this one. So I'm going to have to be a little more careful with stuff like that. That means it's just time to do hanging lanterns instead. Got a few more details in here. I went and grabbed these mugs from my garrison, and I've actually put candles in them to give the sort of appearance that there's something probably toxic for non-undead to drink sitting in them. Not for all of them, though. You know, some patrons have already finished their drink. I also added in those crates over there, some barrels stacked in the corner, just stuff to make it feel more like this space is being used and lived in. We also finished up all of the hanging lanterns here. I put them all at different sizes to give a more chaotic look to it, and threw some cobwebs around, and I think it's really helped tie the whole place together and just add to that creepy, forsaken feel in a lot of ways. I can see myself role-playing in this space a lot. That just leaves one final finishing touch to the build, and that is on the stage here. I already got a start on it, just testing stuff out with these boom boxes where I use this Mechagon table to make a very simple audio amplifier appearance. Because I want this to look like it could exist in World of Warcraft and have that grungy goblin feel to it. But this isn't the only thing. I also need a drum set, a microphone, and 2 guitars, which is all going to be a lot of kit bash stuff. And after much fiddling, we are done. We've got guitars, one for Siobhan, my Forsaken Warlock, and another for Doe, my Undead Night Elf Hunter. More Horde themed, more Fel themed. Best I could do, just basically using the Elven shelves and some beams to give it a little bit of detail in the general shape. There are ways I've seen to get guitar strings involved, but since we're trying to keep our budget low right now, I decided to leave it at this. The microphone, however, for being only 3 pieces, I'm really happy with. Of course, another beam, and then this is actually the water pump from Stormsong Valley with a dyed wicker basket on top to get that sort of microphone texture going. I think it looks really nice as like a grungy, like WoW style microphone. And then the drum set. I'm really proud of this. This is actually 2 barrels, one inside of the other. The one inside is flipped around so you see the bottom of it, and then it's dyed to have this different drum head and the metal rim and the different colors and all of this. We've also got cymbals. They're not quite ideal, but that's really the best you can do for basic cymbals with what we have in the system. But I think this all really tied the stage together. Of course, we've got the boom boxes as well with a more simple mechanical look. You can even sit behind the drum kit here and actually look like you're going to play the drums. It's sized for my Tauren, so Vice is looking a little bit short here. She is sized properly for the microphone. So I think this all turned out really great and finally completes this build. One final walkthrough and ignoring the placeholder scaffolding I've got in this other room to get in. You enter through this curtain, keeping the area sealed off, hiding the spot of architecture, and immediately greeted with a balcony that overlooks this, what I'm thinking is going to be a lore of a mine from the Third War that has since been abandoned and was bought out to make this sort of inn. Hence you have the rocky walls. This actually leads somewhere else, but using the web it feels fairly hidden. You come around with plenty of seating for people and drinks, some of them steaming with this green, Fel, Blight, just maybe even Skull Smasher, classic undead drink energy. This will lead eventually to my Death Knight's room, and I might give it a little bit more flair once I've gotten started on her space. Then to these stairs, which I'm particularly proud of, and it rounds the corner here to the bar proper. We've got this keg again for pouring more of the drinks. There's actually a different keg item that I've then put a blight barrel on top of to get the tap. Another keg over here to get this sort of supports for another blight barrel. And then all of this detail in the bookshelf back here. We've got these apothecary cabinets, little areas for making your drinks, books for recipes, and of course, a secret door to what will eventually be my Forsaken Warlock's room. These cabinets are separate as well. Just some storage back there and up there. Of course, on the main floor, we've also got more seating for people. And then back through these curtains, we've got some nice booth seating for a more private meeting place. Again, this is going to be a space for roleplay, so I want to have plenty of opportunities and angles for people to take. Maybe some of the guild leaders will have a private meeting back here one of these days. Finally, we come to the stage. We've got guitars for the Undercity Sirens, drums, microphone. The Undercity Sirens, of course, being my group of undead, my 4 undead all in a band together, with Vice as the lead singer, being the banshee that she is. And we've got Siobhan, my warlock, on guitar, Doe, my hunter, night elf hunter, on another more horde-themed guitar, and Rokara, my Tauren death knight, on the drums. And all of it represented with this banner, which can be taken as an Undercity Sirens banner, or I am a big Sylvanas lover, so it can also just be a banner of the Dark Lady as it's meant to represent, and fits with this whole shady theme. I was actually very inspired by this art piece by Kotkrieg. It's one of my favorite pieces of Warcraft art, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to fully capture the vibe with the build, but it's turned out way better than I could have imagined. We've got a lot of clutter. I would love to have more, but I'm trying to be careful on the budget, which already went to about 500 on just this room alone, and that's a quarter of our budget just for this, and we have several more rooms to go. Today, we'll be expanding that undead atmosphere further by going into this back hidden cave and building a nice little cave home for my main character here, Vice, this spooky banshee girl. But before we do that, I actually want to revisit the exterior that we built in our first episode, because Blizzard has just made an amazing update. Housing exteriors have been given an extra 50 budget to play with, so we're going to be adding some things out here, further expanding on this, more greenery, and I think trying to make a waterfall coming down from the cliffs up here, and possibly redoing some of this fountain, because I want to use the light well for a build inside that I have in mind for the future. We get into building here, and throughout the building segments in the rest of the video, I'd like to talk about Vice and her history and backstory. Vice Shadowbloom was actually born as Velaray Fireheart at around the time of the First War. She was born in the wilds of Silvermoon to two hunter parents who sort of raised her as they lived off the land day by day. When she was about 5, though, they took her to Silvermoon and ultimately left her there because it was simply too difficult to raise a child out in the wilds. In Silvermoon, alone and abandoned, she grew up largely on the streets with some occasional assistance from figures such as the matron, who owns this sort of housing establishment that I'm building here, a blood elf crime lord who set her to use pickpocketing until she was eventually kicked out. There she learned to fight and sort of grew a proclivity towards violence that had been sort of present ever since she was a youth skinning animals. Few hours of fiddling here. I've now made some good use of that extra 50 decor. First is I redid this fountain some, like I said. We now are using a brazier of a loon rather than the sort of midnight light well, and that actually I think works even better because not only was I able to lower the rocks so that this can be more exposed, which makes it look a lot nicer, but it also gives these drifting light motes that almost makes it look like all of this water comes from the Vale of Eternal Blossoms in Pandaria. These are just Durotar fountains in the wall back here. And then to further enhance this monk area, I made this little pavilion with this bell and weapons for training, and then this is an area where I can use it for roleplay if, I ever wanted to fight another character. Then heading over to the back section of the plot, a lot has changed. I moved where the sort of seating area was. Originally it was over here, sort of bumped right to the edge of the plot, but I put it here instead. You still get a great view of the waterfall from either of these seats, and I put these Arathi trellises here, just to give a little more of this enclosed space, make it feel like part of the environment. You get some nice shade going. With the remaining budget I had, I just added more of these Silvermoon bushes. These are really nice for tying the whole thing together, like I mentioned in my first episode, and they also help it really feel like an elegant garden. Now, of course, 50 decor increase was a lot and allowed me to do a lot of stuff, but now I'm like, if I just had a little bit more again. I think, though, that this is a really good spot for now, and it's time to head back inside and get working on a pretty big change from this very sunny, fancy oven place for a cave for this gremlin. The general idea with this cave that I have is to make a relatively cramped space. This room is already pretty small, so that's going to be easy. Obviously, everything's going to be covered in rocks, and I want a cool void shrine in the back. And then the rest of it is going to be devoted to Vice's space. She's someone who is just an absolute hoarder. She collects shiny trinkets like she's a crow, and just any random thing, plushies, and she just leaves them, usually buried in holes in the ground. It's going to be fun to add all that clutter, but first, we need to shape out this cave. When she was entering her teenage years, a human priest happened to visit Silvermoon seeking potential priests to join his church in Darrowshire, which was on the road between Lordaeron and Crothalas, and Vice just so happened to cross his path. He found her tending to a mana worm that had been injured, because she has a tendency to care for the broken, damaged things, and seeing the potential that she'd make as a priestess, took her off to his church. There she met Marsabel Peacebloom, a human who had similarly lost her parents. Though the pair initially had a rocky start, Marcy soon came to understand that Vice's issues came largely from her upbringing. With a show of kindness, The girl had the makings of an excellent priest. Okay, so I'm still working on shaping everything out here, but I wanted to show the Void Shrine. Something I really like is you can't even see the entrance from the sort of entrance here. You actually have to go all the way around this corner to get in, and then immediately you have this N'Zothai in the center on top of this altar with a tome that is actually, I'm going to say, something Vice has acquired during roleplay. It's a book to study the shadow given to her by her archpriest. And then I've got this pagoda to make an almost sort of geode type look with these wind chimes hanging down, which I'm picturing as sort of these bone charms since we don't have any Trustvar stuff. Then I've got the dark heart in the back to both show it off and further add to the idea that this is a site that has been unearthed but also converted and modified over the years. But that's the shrine, and now it's on to shaping out the rest of this cave. The years went on and Marcy and Vice grew closer to each other, eventually falling in love, and shortly after they became full priestesses, they got married. Unfortunately, the Scourge would attack Lordaeron not a few months later. As they washed over Darrowshire, Vice hid within their temple, cut off from Marcy and the rest of their village. Unbeknownst to her, among some of the villagers she'd been able to get into the temple with her was a member of the Cult of the Damned, who struck her down and raised her as a banshee. The process seeped the shadows through her body and into her mind, and for the next 2 years, as she fought as a member of the Scourge, these whispers always taunted her. Sylvanas was ultimately able to free her along with many of the other undead of Lordaeron, and Vice sought little more than to return to Darrowshire and the woman that she had once loved. Unfortunately, in the interceding time, Marcy had joined the Scarlet Crusade, swearing vengeance for the loss of the woman she loved and vowing to purge the undead from Lordaeron. When Vice came to find Marcy, Marcy saw nothing more than a monster and lashed out. Vice left in sorrow, and the whispers were the sole comfort she had now. She embraced the shadows, using their powers to work as a Deathstalker as one of Sylvanas' forces, hunting the paladins and especially Marcy without any remorse. So I've been hard at work shaping out the cave, and I've got it to a pretty good point here, I think. I think otherwise the shape has been formed pretty naturally all around this void fountain well in the center thing. Really like how it works as a centerpiece. Of course, we've got the actual shrine back here. Very hidden away now that all the boulders are in place. And then back over in this corner is where I'm going to sort of set up Vice's room. And then the rest of the place is going to be decorated with various more sparse clutter. She likes her tight, cramped spaces, so I'm going to have a lot of fun just covering this place in clutter. All the while, Vice had seeked this reconnection with Marcy, her mind twisted, believing that their love had not actually died, but simply taken upon itself a more violent form, and this game of cat and mouse was simply how it expressed itself now. Such was the way until the times of Mists of Pandaria, when Vice and Marcy had another encounter that left Marcy in a position to kill Vice, but instead of following through, she simply made it clear she had loved Vice still. She saw the woman for what she was, but all the harm that had happened over the interceding years had forever shattered any chance of them rekindling what they'd had. She left Vice, now shattered both emotionally and physically, at the foot of the Peak of Serenity. There she was taken in by the Pandaran monks and tended to, and for once seemed to want to embrace something other than the monster that she'd become, to become better, more of the person and priest that she once was. She trained as a monk, and when the Legion invaded the world once more, she fought amongst the Order of the Broken Temple. In the wake of the Legion's defeat, she remained with the Order, but the drums of war soon beat once again, and Sylvanas put out the call for all Forsaken warriors to come lend their aid to her cause. Vice did so, bringing her new monk skills to bear against the Alliance in Darkshore, only to be abandoned once again by her Banshee Queen this time. So I've sort of finished up here. I've gotten a lot of details in, added these sort of tumbleweeds to the ceiling to make it feel like roots and emphasize that we're underground, put some cobwebs around, put some nice dark flowers growing out of the pool, and of course filled Vice's little space with clutter. I used goblin trash piles and kobold treasure piles to give the idea that there's more under here than there actually is. And then I just put a bunch of random doodads and knickknacks all on top of here. Some monk stuff, a mirror that I clipped rugs into to give it this sort of shattered look. And I think this all looks really nice and perfectly captures that sort of like random hoarded objects feel that I wanted to go for with Vice. Also a Xalatath picture. And originally, this is where I was going to end the video. But I had a couple of days where I was busy before I could edit it. And in that time, I realized that while I do really like what I've built here, it's not really what I wanted to build for Vice. Like, this void room is really cool, but it's not how Vice would have a void room like this. And it's also not something at this current stage of her character where she would have a shrine like this. She's not really fully into void stuff yet. If she will be, I'll find out in roleplay. Similar goes for this well. In general, the space just feels like a space that Vice lives in, rather than Vice's space. Now that fits the character well for someone who's never really had a home, but I think if I fully emphasize that this is her space, made more of the creepy art that she enjoys making with some pieces like the deer trophies, made it a bit more scattered, kept a sort of shrine to worship at, but made it a bit more her style and a bit less Xalatath, Voidy, Nazoth style, a monk area, stuff like that. So I'm actually going to go ahead and tear a lot of this down, keep the stuff that I liked, and we're going to rework this into a state that I think I'm going to be much happier with. Lost once more, she returned to Pandaria, spending years traveling by her lonesome. It was not until the time of the War Within that Vice left Pandaria once again. While some heard the radiant song, Vice was like Alaria in the sense that she only heard aberrant, vicious whispers of the void. She ultimately found her way back to the Forsaken and joined an order known as the Convocation of Darkness, a splinter of the Cult of Forgotten Shadow, to which Vice hoped she might be able to find some control for the chaotic whispers inside her head, and more importantly, some company and friendship, something that she had been lacking for years. She was indeed able to find friends, although the whispers remain unabated, and for a time she enjoyed a return to romance once more with an elf by the name of Elrakar Duskbinder, only for that too to end in tragedy when they went to hunt Marcy together, and Vice learnt that her once love had fully moved on with her life. Though she was astray for a time, she ultimately returned to the Convocation. The whispers have grown even more aberrant as of late, and as we turn towards midnight, it remains to be seen whether she will be able to conquer them, or whether they will control and consume her completely. Okay, I've been at it for about a good 3 or so hours now, going back and forth, grabbing more decor, and just generally tweaking the shape of everything. As you can see, it's a lot more open now. I've got rid of the well in the center. There's no longer the shrine back here. I think that this is a lot better of a fit. I've used this sort of area with dyed cobbles to make it look almost like a void, like there's a yawning abyss, which I think is a great thing for her to have. And then there's just a lot more clutter around. I've tucked treasure piles into the corners. I've made a little monk area for her to train in, and then this area hasn't changed all that much, slight shifts in the decor, but I did add this nice little target practice for her because she is not a paladin fan. And something I really like is that I put a seat here so she can sort of sit on the edge of over this abyss and dangle her legs, which I think is definitely something she'd do and be fun. And then over on this side, I have made quite the macabre display. Again, dyed cobbles. This is a trick that someone in my guild actually showed me, where you can make blood stains using dyed cobbles. These are using, I believe it's deep royal red dye. But this is where she does her macabre art that she really likes, since she does so much hunting of random critters in the wild, and then will make decorations out of their bones and stuff like this, combining multiple different parts together, hanging little bone charms from them. And then this altar then serves both as a workplace to work on this sort of art, but also a place at which to pray to the shadow. I think that this is a pretty nice with the purple glow sort of representation of a shadow effigy. And then of course this book by the Archdeaconess Letitia Walsingham, that she was gifted by the Archpriest of the sort of guild that she's in to study the shadow. So it all came together really well, I think. I prefer it much more over what we had initially. It feels so much more like Vice. It feels more like a space that can live in. There's a few different hubs for RP that I can use if I ever want to meet someone in here. And it's a lot creepier as well, which I really enjoy. But there are just a few finishing touches that I have to do, a little bit of decor I want to put around, but for that, I'm going to need to do some crafting, which is something I've sort of been avoiding, sort of dreading, but it's high time we got on that because there are future builds I know that I'm going to need some crafted objects for. So I'm going to go do that, and then I'm going to fill out the rest of the space with those, and it'll be finally done. As a person, though, Vice is rather eccentric. She's generally on the friendlier side, especially after her monk training, and she has a deep sympathy for all things broken. She gets a little wild in combat, becoming lost in the act of harm, but in times of peace she tends towards grinning and making friends, just generally being positive in a way that is typically eerie and unsettling to most people, though she struggles to see that's the case. Because she tends to enjoy the macabre, she likes to make grisly art and haunt the woods out in Terracefall and now Razorwind Shores, where she hunts animals both big and small. She also tends to be a hoarder of objects, big and small, basically anything shiny, trash, plushy or cute, especially the cute, that catches her eyes. She is an utter mess, but in the way that so many messy characters that have gone through so much often are for me, I want only the best for her, even if as a writer I am often giving her the worst. Hope you enjoyed learning about her, because there will be more character summaries to come, not all as fraught nor as wide-spanning as Vice's. She is my main, of course, so she gets to be involved in a lot of the expansions that I've really enjoyed. There we go. It was just a few pieces, but I think they've all helped to tie together. We've got this totem and then this scarecrow, which along with the fence creates a really nice separation between the two different areas. That's something to always be wary of when making an open space, is dividing up different parts of the build so that different spaces feel like they have different purposes. And then the other thing I did was add these raptor plushies around. I know there are wolf plushies in the files that are probably coming with the shop later, which I feel like, wolf and griffin plushies are a Horde and Alliance aesthetic that should probably be something you can just get in game. But that aside, we're probably going to be replacing these raptor plushies, or at least some of them, with wolf plushies once we get them. But for now, having them about as this cute but deadly sort of predatory species is something that Vice would really enjoy, the sort of macabre nature, sort of in some ways how she sometimes sees herself, especially with this over here. This is actually an art piece that I have talked about her having created in roleplay before and with my guild, where it's essentially this wolf carcass, but in the center of it is supposed to be a bunny, but a raptor plushie will do, to sort of essentially represent this idea that on the outside, Vice is this scary, terrifying wolf monster, but in the inside, she's just a cute, scared, innocent little bunny, which I think is fun. Today, we're switching things up from this very dreary undead aesthetic. As you can see, I'm on my Blood Elf Paladin, because we're going to go out and into the Blood Elf section of the house and get to work on a nice chapel for her. Because the front of the house has just been these empty rooms for too long, and my guild is starting to roleplay in our houses, and I want them to actually have something nice to see when they walk in, rather than this awkward scaffolding. So we're going to get to that today. I'm going to start off by laying down some basic structure, putting in some proper stairs, and I'll be back with you in a minute. So just like last time, as we get to building here, I'm going to talk about Cypher's backstory. Cypher is my Blood Elf Paladin, and initially she was just meant to be an NPC. She's Vice's sister, and she was more of a background character to add some contrast to Vice's life of what could have been. But through role-playing her and the way the story developed, she actually ended up developing into a character that I wanted to play more primarily. So let's start at the beginning. Cypher was born a few years before the Third War, and she was born in similar conditions to Vice. Her parents were both hunters who lived off the land, But unlike Vice, about a few years after she was born, the Third War happened, and her parents, shaken by the unfathomable loss to their people that they witnessed, decided to instead lend their aid to help in the efforts of rebuilding the Blood Elf Society. They did what they could to help repair things, and in the aftermath, they turned their skills with bows and weapons to forming a archery shop, where they made fine bows for organizations like the Far Striders and weapons for the Blood Knights. Okay, so I've been at it for a couple of hours now, and I am really happy with how it's coming together. I've based it both off of real-life churches that have this sort of center aisle with the side aisles separated by pillars before they branch out into the central worship area, but it's also been inspired by the Paladin Order Hall, which is of course itself inspired by real-life churches, just to get that Warcraft flair. I had recently been reading the novel Blood Ties, which has some beautiful descriptions of wielding the light and the Paladin Order Hall within it, and that is what really inspired me to sort of make this build and start it and do it in this way. Of course, all of it is centered around the Lightwell from the Midnight Epic Edition. My sort of headcanon idea for this is that there's a convergence of ley lines upon this particular isle, and this Lightwell was constructed in order to draw from it, much in the same way that Night Elves do with their Moonwells, just with that Blood Elf arcane flair, perhaps a little bit of the Sunwell's energy poured into it as well, to make this perfect little central worship area that can then be used for anyone preaching. They can stand upon this lip and speak out to the rest of the church. These plinths, as you can see, already have objects on them. These are going to be reliquaries. Another feature of the church is people pass through, they pass by holy relics and sort of receive their blessing from them. Meanwhile, these side rooms, this one, cramped as it is going to be Cypher's. She is just a recruit after all, though she is getting the benefits from the matron of getting to live on this sort of property. Whereas this one I'm thinking is going to be a forge. I have this big empty space. This is going to be future horde rooms, which I'm going to have to find out a way to hide. Way in the future though, Blood Elf and Undead stuff's getting the focus first. But it was important that I had them in right now so that I could know how I need to hide them ahead of time. And then we have more custom stairs. These are just using the Belemeth pillars and a rug, and they are exceedingly steep. No real stairs would be this steep, but they're fully functional. You can go up, and they need to be this steep because they come right to this door to this horde space. And also I want their footprint to be small enough that this whole room, which is going to be sort of the matron's office and private chambers, has enough room to build all of that within it. But that's the progress so far. I think the structure looks really great. It's perfectly capturing the energy I want. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start filling out some detail work. I need more relics. I need some lighting. But that lighting in particular is going to require some professions, so I'm going to get on that and I'll get back to you once we've got some details in. Now, Cypher grew up in this time of great struggle for the Blood Elves, seeing all of her people trying to just survive day by day, struggling with their mana addiction, but it was also a time of heroes. She witnessed figures like Lady Liadrin and Lorthma Theron rise from the ashes to help form new orders and set their people on a brighter path. And this deeply inspired Cypher. She knew that one day she would try to become one of those heroes. But her parents, who were overprotective of her given what they'd witnessed and their experience with their first child, did not want her to do so. They instead set her to working on the family business, crafting at bows, but Cypher would sneak off at night and practice with a staff, hoping that one day she'd have the chance to become a hero. So it turns out these sconces, which I was wanting to use for their sun theme, actually don't give off any light at all. So we're going to have to think of something else for our lighting solution. When she reached adulthood, her parents finally decided to let her spread her wings a little. They just had their second child, a girl by the name of Karia, and figured that it was time that Cypher started to venture beyond the roost. They allowed her to study at the Silvermoon University, learning magic, which was a far cry from the more martial disciplines that Cypher was interested in, but she'd take it, only to be disappointed when she found that she was being forced into an enchantment program. But she kept at it because she's ever a determined individual, and she knew that if she just showed her magical aptitude, then she would be able to prove herself and perhaps enter into a combat path instead. An opportunity of a different sort would arise. Erica Dustbinder, at the time the love of Vice, would visit Silvermoon in order to find out history about Vice's family, who Vice believed had perished in the Second War because that's the lie that her parents had spun. Instead, he'd encounter them very much living, with Cypher there, and after some pleasant exchanges, unveil the truth of what had happened to their wayward daughter, a truth that Cypher had kept from her for all those years. The solution I ultimately ended up doing for the lighting was these floating light wells from the Priest Order Hall, and I actually think that they worked out a lot better than the original candle idea I had in mind, was not only do they cast a lot more light than any of the candles, but they have a distinctly elven feel. Blood elves love using their arcane magic to levitate things around. It also adds some much needed asymmetry to what was otherwise a very symmetrical build. Although I did find a use for the sconce that I made, which was very expensive gold-wise, to sort of serve as a centerpiece for the shrine, which I think looks really good. I also put in these ochre windows all throughout. They work really well as sort of stand-in stained glass windows, and another great thing is they cast orange light, which is perfect for this very Sunwell Blood Elf feel. I'm particularly proud of this almost sun-like symbol for this big stained glass centerpiece over here, and I've hidden a Librum from the Paladin Order Hall, which shines a beam of light behind it to really make it feel like when you're standing here kneeling before this well of arcane and light power, that you are being blessed by the light. These windows don't really make a whole lot of sense technically, since right behind them is a wall, and at this stage in the build we're meant to be more underground, so this one especially doesn't make sense. But the nice thing about this being an elven temple is that they use a lot of magic and a lot of enchantments for stuff, so I figured that's what it's also like. We also do see in the Paladin Order Hall in WoW that even though that is underground, there's light shining through, so I think it really works for this to be such a holy place that even underground, even where it doesn't make sense, the light of the Sunwell is present. Of course, simple benches and pews to surround it, some nice bushes to sort of add some greenery to this place. And we ended up replacing these pedestals with pedestals from the Priest Order Hall. They have a bit more interest in them going on, and they're also lower budget, which is nice. We've just got various holy looking relics sitting on top of them. So I think this has all come together really well, captured the exact sort of aesthetic that I wanted. And now we look towards the forge in here and Cypher's room in here. So I'm going to get working on those. This revelation further set Cypher against what had been her controlling parents and are now proven to be deceptive ones. She decided that no more would she allow her path to be determined by them, and with Auricar Dustbinder's help, she was able to find a place as a Blood Knight acolyte, serving his still living family in training. With further help from the matron sponsorship, she was able to acquire arms and armor to assist in her training, while she hopes to rekindle her connection with her parents one day. For now, she is content to train as a Blood Knight, following that path that she ever wished to, in order to defend and uplift her people. As the void descends upon Silvermoon and Midnight, it remains to be seen whether Cypher will be able to rise up and defend her people as she had wished to as a child during those years of strife, or whether the weight of the crushing darkness will crush her in turn. The room for Cypher done here. It's pretty simple, but given the space, it kind of has to be simple. To fill up the doorway here that would lead to the Forsaken area, I made it into a sort of recessed closet bookshelf. Because this place is so small, I'm trying to be as economical as possible, and I feel like that's a pretty good way of doing it. We've got this desk for her studies, which she is quite studious. A few little trinkets and toys, because much like Vice, she is a fan of the cute things, although in a very different way. We've got these curtains acting as a privacy screen to the actual back bedroom here. We've got this nice elven bed. It's pretty extravagant, but it fits with the whole general theme again, more toys. Chest to keep some of her more valuable possessions, and then a nice little bath, and of course a poster of an elven hero, because Cypher is very inspired by the heroes of her people, and so she would naturally want to go to sleep looking up at a painting of one of them, even if she's not really the most paladin-y sort, but that kind of has an appeal to Cypher as well. I know there's elven baths in the files, but I don't think we're getting those until midnight, so this will have to do now. It is a very awkward, like filled up space, but it really, I think, gives that very basic, tiny, cramped apartment feel, which is exactly what I'm going for. She's not exactly from a wealthy family. She's being sponsored to study as a paladin, so she gets essentially the necessities right next to where she'd be training and doesn't get any extravagant big room. But with that side of the temple done, it's time to take it over to this one and work on what I'm thinking will be a forge area, but honestly, this space is currently pretty up in the air of what it'll ultimately be, so we'll see how things actually play out. As far as personality goes, Cypher is hopeful, determined, and kind. Though she seeks to be a hero for her people, it's not out of any sense of ego. She genuinely has a desire to protect people, born from the fact that when she was a youth, she had to witness so much suffering while being completely powerless to do anything to stop it. She's the sort who, if she sees someone in trouble, her body will move before her mind has any time to think, and the sort of person who will see someone struggling and reach out to heal their heart before she thinks of turning her blade against them. Though she is very much a typical paragon, she is not without her flaws. She's impetuous, she can be at times very brash and standoffish, and she struggles with being told no. She wants to reach her goals right now, and she has little time for the barriers that are put in her way, even if they're put there for good reason. All in all, of all my characters, she's the most truly heroic, which also means she has the farthest to fall, but hopefully she's able to keep her chin up, maintain her faith in the light, and stand strong against the void and midnight. So it turns out that this place was way too small to fit a forge. I tried the best I could. There just wasn't a way to make it work, so instead, it's now just an armory of sorts. We've again used this recessed cabinet technique with the door, this time with a more rustic cabinet since I expect the armory is going to lack some of the elegance of the rest of the place. Just various weapon caches around, a sort of grindstone for sharpening and repairing things, but my favorite detail is this little hidden area back here. You can click onto a seat to get into. It takes you to this nice little romantic hidden picnic area, because I feel like all good religious cloisters in a fantasy setting are not complete without a nice romantic hideaway for some of the people training there to get away and enjoy a private moment together. Of course, you can get back out with the stool over here. Fun bit of interactive design as well. Very basic room, but the whole aesthetic came together really well, and it fits the whole temple vibe going on. And with that, let's do one final walkthrough of this elven temple. Of course, this was based on real church designs with this central walkway and these side paths, relics on display for people to walk by and feel blessed by as part of the reliquary. Our guild's lore is that this island was established with the help of the reliquary, and so it even better fits that there would be relics about. Then the shrine with these beams of light coming down from this grand sun-style stained glass window. A bunch of light sunwells floating around as well to further illuminate the place and add that elven flair, and of course seats for the people using this establishment. Back towards the entrance, we've got custom stairs leading up to a second floor, which will eventually be filled. And then on the side, we've got a room for Cypher, cramped and pretty simplistic, but a nice little apartment for her, first time really being independent, some toys scattered about, and then a private back area for her to sleep and wash up. And then on the other side, a rustic armory for all the needs of the paladins and priests in this space to repair their weapons, gather new armor and arms, and if they want a private moment with someone, sneak into this little back picnic area and enjoy a nice reprieve from the place. But I am really happy with how this all came together, especially this central hallway. I had a vision in mind, and though I had to change some things, it otherwise came together exactly how I was hoping for, and I'm really looking forward to using this place for roleplay and the like with that with Cypher and my other characters in the future. Today, we're going to take things back to the very first room of the house, which has thus far gone entirely untouched, to build an elven tavern to serve as a nice entryway for people coming into the build. It's high time this place saw some love, so that my guildies actually have a proper place to enter through, and I'm thinking that it's not just going to be a tavern. Because as I've looked at this room and fiddled around with some things, I've realized that this is a lot of space to work with, and The layout would actually be better served by divvying it up. So we're going to cut off some portions of this room to make that forge I was planning on making last episode, as well as whatever other ideas strike my mind. But first, we need to lay down some structure, so I'm going to get right to that. So I've been at it for a bit here. It's actually the next day, and I'm really happy with how it's coming together. Working with this large room has been something of a challenge, but it's also led to a lot of designs I wouldn't be able to do otherwise, like this recessed booth seating with these pillars that I think looks really nice. I've actually, if I go into the housing menu here, you can see that I've actually used these corners to further hide the shape of this room. Cutting it off here also allows this sundial to be sort of right in the middle of the stage here. I'm shaping this stage to be more for a single performer, like a singer or someone playing the harp or something like that. But they're framed really well with this domed ceiling, drawing your eye here, and then this sort of pillar directly above the center. There's going to be lighting here that's even going to work it better. And then come into the back rooms. This situation's a little awkward with going through a door to get into the church. I've been considering redoing my housing layout a little bit, and in that case, this church would be moved back and this would be more of an in section before you get to it. But I've got the makings of a forge back here, and in this tiny little room which has a door leading to the stage, I've just got a very simple makeshift dressing room, though I'm honestly considering converting it so that this forge area is just one whole entire dressing room, or maybe like a kitchen type thing, and then we can have a more like clear path to get into this space. But all in all, I'm really happy with it. I think that in general, when designing rooms like this, you want to follow the grid. The walls already have pillars in place, which create perfect delineating lines for where to place things, and it makes the shape feel a lot more natural and cohesive. If it weren't for how big these walls are and the fact that they awkwardly clip into the ceiling like this, you would barely be able to tell that this wasn't the natural shape of the room. But I've still got a lot to go in structure. I need to get a bar, I'm thinking in this corner, and I need to work out what I'm doing over here. The rest is probably going to be seats, and we need a proper lighting situation plus the back. So I'm going to get right back to it. Checking back in here, I may have let things get a little bit away from me. I've just been loving the process of this build, it's been flowing super well, but we've finally got to a point where the layout is pretty good, and there's even some detail work in. Firstly, I want to highlight this stage. I used again that Librum from the Paladin Order Hole to create a beam of light down to further sort of accentuate and highlight it along with the chandeliers. And here we have a custom harp. These strings are just these same chandeliers. It's actually the best string texture that I've found in the game so far. Then of course we've got our bar solution. It's pretty simple, but given the footprint that we're working with, and I see this more as a fancy establishment and less as a sit down at the bar and drink away sort of establishment. There's likely orders being taken out from here rather than people coming up to take their orders. So it doesn't need to be as extravagant, but we have also a place to cook. I also like the way I've sunk the bookshelf back here to where it's showing the wall through, and it makes it feel like this sort of wooden wine rack that's built into the structure itself. And then just some tables scattered about. I really like this place, especially this dragon skeleton, to almost look like it's been enchanted to be breathing fire. Something you see in a lot of Blood Elf architecture is this sort of like cushioned, rugged seating area. Once we are able to get hookah, those are definitely going to be going here. But I like it as this nice little place to fill the area around the fire, also gives an alternative to the seating. It's a bit more communal and open as well compared to the seats, which I think is nice. And something I've done with this place that I haven't really done throughout the rest of my builds, although obviously the Forsaken builds was naturally like this, is make the lighting a little bit more moody. I shrunk the size of these table lamps so they don't project as much, and we get more darkness in here. And the reason for that is I want the stage to be the brightest place in the build, so your eyes are just attracted to it. And also, if this is meant to be a fancier establishment, people are going to want privacy in their dining areas as they enjoy the show. So it just makes sense for the lighting to generally be lower for that purpose. As for the rest of the build, I've made more of an effort on the changing room back here. Still needs a lot of detail work, but I have a layout that I like, and shaping it like that to be more of a hallway has allowed this area to be more open and feel more natural of a flow into the chapel. So it's all coming together, but obviously we have undyed drapes here and a whole bunch of other stuff that needs details. This is well undercooked. So I'm going to go grab a bunch of decor, a bunch of dyes, all that good stuff, and do a sort of last pass on detailing work in this room before we start hitting up these back areas, and finally do something with the entryway. Okay, so I just put in a ton of time farming up stuff from professions, mostly in Shadowlands, some in Dragonflight as well. You can already see I placed down one of these decorations, but it's given me what I'm hoping will be some good decor, because there sadly isn't a lot of options for more elegant glasses or bottles decor-wise right now, and some of the options are insanely expensive. There is a bottle that comes from Burning Crusade that's just an old school Blood Elven bottle model, and it takes 4 Corium ore, which is about 3,000 gold. So even putting in the effort to craft a lot of this myself, which does make it cheaper, it's still just so much. But we've got some good options, so I'm going to start playing around with them, and we're going to try and get a detail pass finally done on this place. Okay, so I've got a bunch of details in, but I'm actually going to start in the entryway here. This is probably all it'll end up being, just a couch, rug, and then something to sit behind to receive guests. I've sort of had it to where the matron has this magical scroll that if someone writes stuff into will get transmitted to her office. So if she has a particularly important guest coming in, she can know ahead of time without anyone having to tell her, for a bit of intimidation factor. So that's what's going on here. But then we come into the main room, and I've made a few changes that are subtle but have made a pretty big impact. The first is I flipped these windows around. This stopped them from casting light and generally made this a lot lower light of a space. I really like the atmosphere I was getting out of making this lower light. There is some illumination here just to add a bit more pop to these areas. And of course, I can always light it back up if I want to. Also, a benefit of WoW's lighting system is that even these areas, which are super dark, don't really feel it because it's more just a soft mood lighting. You can really get away with low light levels in a lot of spaces where it makes sense for it to have them. Something else that using lower lighting does is it creates points of interest. So the stage is the brightest thing in the room, it's what people are going to focus on, which makes sense. It also brings attention to the custom heart build. And then this space has this fancy dragon skeleton. It's more of an open role-playing area. It generates a sense of comfort to have it be brighter. And then what I've done over here is hidden a light inside of this forge, because it doesn't really cast any light by itself, but it does generate some light to pull the eye. It also makes sense that people working at the bar would need some lighting for what they're doing. And then these back areas, the relatively low light makes the space feel more welcoming, but what it does is it creates this sense of contrast. The interior of the pillars get lit, but the exteriors don't, which helps keep the lighting of the central area moody, but then also creates this more sort of cozy atmosphere once you're actually in this back area. I think lighting is something that when you're building, it can be really useful to play around with, because not every build is going to warrant this sort of brilliant, bright elven chapel to radiate this sense of the holy light shining through. But I think for now that this is the sort of aesthetic that I want to capture here. I've been watching the Mighty Nine animated series. I was particularly inspired by the design of the lavish chateau in that series for this area. And so the moody lighting, I think, helps a lot. Then at the bar, I used these trellises to create a more enclosed space and again added this more elegant feel. We did the same trick we did in our Undercity bar of hiding this normal keg design under just a barrel to give it this elven feel. And then these three props I use throughout. This is a Venthea goblet, a Venthea anima bottle, and a Valdrakken tea set. That just gives us a variety of drinks, although I think in hindsight the Venthea anima bottle serves as almost looking more like a hookah until we can actually get those in the game itself, especially in the rug area over here by the fireplace. Behind this sort of like bar working area, I just used a Valdrakken bookcase, which I think I'm going to use a lot more of throughout building my elven areas because it's one asset and it's full of books and it looks really nice. But otherwise, we just get enough of a suggestion that you can make drinks here. We're working on a smaller scale, so I'm not going overboard back here. And something else I did was I got these potted plants around that I think just adds a bit more greenery to this place. And all in all, I think that with these extra details, with these cups, and tea sets and all that added about, we've ultimately got a space that really embodies this sort of elegant, rich club feel. Next up, we're going to have to head into these back rooms here because I've got a dressing room to finish designing. And then I have to work out how I'm going to transition this space into the church. But for now, I'm going to focus on the dressing room. The back room's done here, but before I actually venture into them, I want to highlight something I've done with the entrance. Because this hallway is meant to be open to the public, I needed to communicate that, and we've talked about a lot about lighting in this build, and I decided to use a game development technique of making a brighter area to attract the player's eyes. For example, from this entrance you have center point, this little edge seating area, some of the stuff there, but then this bright open doorway. Then I've also used the rug poking out to create the sense that you can cross into here because the space spills outwards. This painting also helps to add to that because it has this sort of additional note of interest on the wall texture, but you can't quite see the full thing, so in order to see the full thing, you need to approach. Then the actual hallway itself is pretty basic. I use the same bushes as within the temple to create a sort of transition between the two areas, further emphasize almost like a breadcrumb trail leading into this space. And then just a casual fountain, you know, it is a very rich place, so an indoor fountain, though it might be excessive elsewhere, would be not out of place in a Blood Elven manor like this. And then again, using lighting. Unfortunately, there is some lighting spill from within this room, so it doesn't quite work, but this area is much darker and it's much more easier to skip over it compared to this bright place, which is good because this leads into our back dressing room, which is meant to be a more private area. Of course, I've just got some very basic customizations here since I don't see this space being used a huge amount and I just need to communicate a vibe more than actually make an extremely extravagant, well-detailed space. I've got these basic cabinets right here. Then the dresses themselves, these are elven tables with mirrors behind, and I've just thrown a few props for the people who sort of serve as performers in this establishment, how they might decorate their dressing space. Of course, coat racks, and it's very well lit so that you can actually use the mirrors for makeup and stuff correctly. And then, of course, this doorway leads out onto the stage itself, so you can go right from the dressing room to the stage. I got rid of the door here that led to the dressing room because I felt like it made a lot more sense for it to be more of a private back room. That is everything, and I just wanted to do one final walkthrough here. We're actually starting outside so you can get the full experience of entering into this build, where you're immediately greeted with this lavish bright stage that catches the eye. Of course, a fairly basic entry room, just a seating area and a place to check for reservations. As you enter in, you're focused on this stage with these brilliant chandeliers and our custom harp that we built, but there's also this light drawing you towards this back hallway, and towards this fireplace seating area, where I've made a few minor detail adjustments. I got rid of a lot of the Venthyr anima bottles and replaced them with these sort of draconic sensors, because I think that they serve a pretty similar purpose while having the same elven feel, and the anima bottles were just a bit too dramatic and a bit out of place, whereas these fit right in. Of course, traveling to your right, you end up in this bar. I've got some meat roasting in the fire, redid this back section a little bit using the spice racks to make it look more like a place you make drinks. This was actually inspiration I got from a house in my Alliance neighborhood. But as you go around, there's these nice planter pots to further liven up the place. More meat I've added to the tables, these various tables for the more moody right up on the stage areas and the more cozy back booth seating. All of this, of course, in a room that's been custom shaped because it did start as a medium octagon room, but it looks very different from that, though the ceiling does help accentuate the stage. Then the light brings you towards this back hallway. These bushes breadcrumb us over to our elven temple, but as you venture further back, you come to this more hidden back door, which opens into our dressing room with coat racks for costumes, individually sort of customized and personalized little areas for applying makeup. And then if you go through this door, you end up right on the stage, back in the center of the room for a performance. I'm very happy with how this came together. This was one of the first rooms I envisioned, and I think it makes the perfect entryway to our home. I can foresee a lot of elven roleplay here. There's a lot of different hubs, like by the fireplace, in these booths, or even on the stage for performances in which I can do roleplay. So I think it all turned out wonderfully. I have a problem. I've got about 3 more rooms I want to build in my WoW house before the release of Midnight increases the decor budget limit, but I only have about 300 budget left before I'm capped out. And these rooms are definitely going to be more than 300 budget each. Now I could just settle for one of them, but I think I can have my cake and eat it too. I think there's a way that I can optimize my other builds, improve the layout of my house, and get to make all the rooms that I want to make all at the same time. Hi, I'm Nyx. Welcome back to my WoW housing series, and today that's exactly what we're going to do. I mentioned I wanted to cut back the budget, and I know exactly where we can start, in Vice's room. While I really liked the build I ultimately ended up with here, it still doesn't really feel like Vice, and on top of that, it cost about 400 budget to make. In comparison, this Blood Elven Temple, which I'm really happy with, only took about 300 budget. So we're gonna head into the housing menu here, and start off really simply. I'm going to say one final farewell to this scripted build with all its little knickknacks everywhere, and then that room's going to get deleted. Already, we saved about a good 450 budget off doing that alone. Of course, we're going to get some of that back as we rebuild the room today. I think that what actually fits her the best is honestly just going to be a simple hallway room. There's still a ton of space to work with in a hallway, but it also keeps that level of crampedness that I feel fits Vice. And with our general theme that we've got going on of this being a fourth wall mine that has since been bought and converted, I can easily make this into a mine shaft of sorts. So the first thing that's going to happen now that we've got our basic layout in is I'm going to rebuild Vice's room from the ground up. There won't be a huge amount of crazy changes because a lot of her aesthetics are staying the same, but in this cramped space I'm going to emphasize that a lot more and really make something that I feel truly fits her. So I've reworked Vice's room here. Instead of a cave, we've gone with an abandoned mineshaft concept. So we've got these collapsed beams and cobweb that you have to enter through. Then you immediately see this trail of blood, the sort of creepy art made of bones and sticks and old pelts that she likes to make, greeting you and also sort of warding you off as you enter. Beams set up to sort of make it feel like this mine's been collapsed, and then she clawed her way into it. I actually used the waning wood fence, which is one decor, but has this great, like, old wood look to it to get even more of that experience. Then you have to sort of squeeze your way in there. You can't just walk right through super easily. You have to kind of wiggle around a little bit, and it takes you back to Vice's little sanctuary back here. The idea I have for this was an old miner's office. That's why we have like this table in and then this raised platform. Vice has converted this platform to a training area, of course, kept that Turalian portrait with an axe in it because she does not like her paladins. We've got some monk weaponry as well, a nice little platform for her to train and then also potentially do combat RP on. A pile with more bones, more heads, more stuff to make her art. Of course, more blood underneath it. Banner for her queen, chimes from the ceiling like before, but less because for whatever reason, these pretty low polygon chimes are 5 decor budget each. Then this table is great because it's got all this clutter on it that really fits the theme, the skull especially. The knife into a wanted poster could very much be a knife into a sort of picture of Marcy for Vice wanting to hunt her. But all of this clutter is baked into this table, so you get a ton of random objects, which works great for Vice, but you also only have to do 5 decor budget. And then of course her room, which hasn't changed a whole lot, although I think it looks a lot better to have this sort of tent makeshift strung up into the back of this abandoned mineshaft here, versus the old one where it was just sort of hanging there from the roof, kind of in the middle of the cave. It fits a lot better, and because it's lower to the ground, you can't really see so much out the back of it. It feels more cozy and more cramped because Vice does like those tight, cramped spaces. This sort of crawl space is exactly what I had in mind when I was thinking what sort of room Vice might live in. But not much has changed. We've used kobold treasure piles to make clutter and then put a bunch of random objects across, of course, the Dark Heart and the Eye of N'Zoth, which generates whispers and also relatively well fits the theme, but also these two kind of show off that I have completed those meta achievements. And a pile of pillows for her to sleep on, but she's not a typical bed sort of girl. The book by Archdeaconess Letitia Walsingham, once again, that she studies the shadow from, unicorn that I've clipped into the wall, and a nice pretty light hanging from above. The only light really in this whole place. Purple, of course, since that's her favorite color, and I feel like it's a good spot for it in the back there. This area has come together a lot better than the cave. I feel a lot more confident in this as a space for Vice and a space to roleplay her in. And on the upside, it also saved a ton of budget. I think it knocked off a good about 300 or so budget, which lets me have about 600 budget total left to spend on the rest of the house. With 3 rooms, that's 200 each. Now that's still not ideal, because with the walls and the flooring we'll have to put in, that's going to knock out a chunk, but it's a lot more manageable. I'm going to shift gears and finally make it so that my guildies can at least have a flow through from the start of the house to this room, up the stairs, and then around into the Forsaken area that we'll be using the most, because that is something that's a little awkward for roleplay, is dealing with the fact that there's just an unfinished room along the way. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to make some nice hallways, and the matron's office, the owner of this whole establishment, especially since I have roleplay planned for her in the future, is going to get built right here. But before that, I want to take another crack at these shelves. If we can find a way to lessen the decor cost on these while improving how they actually look, then that will be all the better. I think this looks really nice, and it saved us like 30 budget, which is obviously a huge benefit. You can still get back here to this part, and actually it works even better having the bookcase more concealed by the cabinets themselves, because, like I mentioned in the last episode, you tend to focus on points that are brighter. This is now dark and it's partially concealed, so you're not really seeing it. It's just sort of blending into the background compared to these two cabinets, which further hides this hidden entrance to my apothecary's lair. That's a nice easy improvement there. I also increased those barrel sizes. Just dropped a few bits of extraneous decor that weren't really adding a whole lot to the overall feel, or like providing a lot of detail, but were adding to the decor budget. Or things, now that we're getting into this stage where I have to worry about budget, that I'm going to be doing more of. Let's return to this room now and focus our eyes forwards, as we've got some hallways, and then within those hallways, the office of the matron to build. Neat little trick I just found. Because these walls don't normally reach the ceiling, leaves this awkward gap. But if you use your hotkeys to scale up your decor, even these walls, which normally can't be scaled, as you can see, can actually be scaled up. So I'll be able to have them reach the roof and probably also save on a couple wall pieces here if I'm lucky. Okay, nice and simple structural work done. I already put in some minor details in the hallways. They're probably not going to be super detailed. Again, budget, and they are just a transitionary space. But this will be the entrance to the horde area. As you can see, for now I've got it walled off, just like classic Blizzard devs, putting a fence up to show it's a work in progress. I also put these braziers down in this marker. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for what's supposed to be a sort of like shady, speakeasy type thing to have it this clearly delineated. But this is the sort of thing that you would see Blizzard map designers do to denote, hey, this is the horde area, and if we come on over to the other side, this is the Forsaken area. So I did it because it feels like something that Blizzard themselves would do, which I think is fun for adding some verisimilitude to a WoW housing build. The matron's actual office herself just so far, little raised lips so that when she's sitting on her desk that will be here, she is looking down on anyone who just so happens to be meeting with her. And then these back rooms are going to be real simple bedroom, bathroom type setup. Most of the planning and important office stuff happens in the actual office itself, but I do want my characters to have places to stay within the actual house. I have discovered why they don't allow walls to scale. It's because they don't scale their collision either. But it means they meet the roof, and it also means that I saved on some decor budget because I got to ignore 2 entire wall elements, instead letting me feel pretty guilt-free about adding it to the floor here. That's the framework of the build so far. I'm going to go ahead and get started on filling in all the details here, starting with a nice fancy back window here, and then I'll come back to you when all of it's filled up. Quick check-in here. We've only got a few details in, but it's already really starting to liven up the place. This back window, I think, frames the desk really nicely, and of course, again, I have used the trick with the Librum from the Paladin Order Hall to get this great light shaft shining through and further sort of halo the matron when she is sitting in the chair here. Then an area to receive guests. There's going to be more details here and more seats, of course. And then I think I'm going to keep this. I'm going back and forth on it. The idea of this is a sort of murder board type thing where there are maps and markings and all that sort of laid out. There's not really any good way to do that. Currently, I know there's a Gilneas map, but that's about the closest thing we have to a map for the wall. And it doesn't get that sort of cluttered look I want. So as odd as it is to have stuff like this lantern hanging out, I think that this works. But I'm going to keep at it. I'm going to get some stuff in these side rooms, and hopefully I'll be talking to you again when we're done. We wrap up building here. I wanted to talk real quick about the matron because I've referenced her in a lot of my videos, but I haven't actually talked about what her deal is. Her history prior to the time in the row is somewhat shrouded in mystery. She's a noblewoman in Silvermoon by the name of Lady Serenrai Lasari. Though she wasn't always a noble, that came recently when she helped with the rebuilding efforts following the Scourge's invasion of Quel'Thalas. But the way she actually makes most of her gold is as a crime lord in Murder Row, capitalizing on the sort of suffering there to continue growing her operation in magical item trading, illicit substance smuggling, assassination, all that fun stuff. She does also provide a home and sanctuary and a safe part of the row for the people under her care, but that comes with the strings that if they try to leave her care, she might not smile upon that too fondly if they're doing it in a way that is a threat to her. She's cunning, charming, knows a silver tongue is as powerful as any blade or spell, and she's ever looking for new opportunities, of which the chaos that will come to Silvermoon and Midnight is sure to present many. As for what she's doing, building a home out in Razorwind Shores, she's expanding businesses. She already has a lot of clients for both the Horde and the Forsaken, and it's easier to make certain dealings when you're a bit closer to Orgrimmar than all the way off in Silvermoon. And after chipping away at this for a bit, we are done and ready for a final walkthrough. I'm really happy with how this came together. It fits this sort of energy I was going for of this very elegant, fancy, but also a little shady office extremely well. On the right here, we've immediately got our sort of murder, war planning board for, territory and stuff like that. But I switched it to the board from the Warrior Order Hall because it just generally fits the rest of the energy on this place a lot better, and it also looks a lot nicer and makes a lot more sense if you don't have a floating lantern and stuff like that. This whole desk is just a place for, further planning but also enchanting. The matron does know how to make magical items, and so I put this rod down here and a bunch of tomes, for crushing up gems. And then over here is a place to take guests. Of course, more trinkets around to sort of show her wealth and her years of collection. We've got actually an interactive one right here from the Mage Order Hall that I really like. I could see it playing as a sort of like puzzle box or something like that. It just provides a cool bit of atmosphere and interactivity. And this table seating setup is pretty simple, but I think that there's a certain power dynamic on display here, having this big plush couch she can sit on, and then really basic stools for the people she's meeting. And then the desk, similarly cluttered as that desk over there, but a bit more like focused on, work, floating book from the Mage Order Hall. She can actually sit in it, and I really like how the big lights behind her frame her, and you've got these beams shining in. I see this sort of look all the time with characters in various shows and anime where they've got these huge windows behind them and this light that sort of frames them at the end of this long office, and it makes for a really intimidating look. And then to further add to the fact that, she's smart, well appointed, and also a mage, I use these bookshelves, which are both, hidden wall bookshelves, but they have the benefits of hiding away her sort of nicely appointed bathroom here. I really hope we get that elven bathtub soon. I think that would be really nice and properly fit the theme of this place. But just something simple. I don't have a whole lot of space to work with. Over here, we've got similarly a bedroom. Again, really simple, just a dresser, a mirror, that sort of stuff. Working with what limited space we have, but I think it makes for a nice area. I did consider making one of these back rooms more of like a shady interrogation place. She's a crime lord. If there's someone that she needs to persuade, it might be a good idea to have somewhere that would be a room to do that. But at the same time, I feel like that's what, the shady Forsaken areas are for what the Horde areas are for. This section is a little bit more restricted than the front, but at the end of the day, she's still trying to portray this look of a legitimate businesswoman, and so having her office also having those places right branching off doesn't really fit that super well. And the best part of all of this is it came in at quite the low budget. I think I only used about 200, maybe under 200, including the walls I put in to build this place. And it leaves us with about 275 budget each for the remaining 2 rooms. I'm sure I can find some more elsewhere. I know my apothecary's room's going to take a bit more budget, so we might need to plan out some more stuff there. And that just leaves this final room, which is currently completely empty. We're going to have the apothecary's room on the bottom floor, the Death Knight's room on the top floor, and I think I'm going to go with the Death Knight's room next, because I've been having a lot of inspiration, a lot of ideas for it lately. Today, we're going to take things back into that undead style as I build a room for my Tauren Death Knight here. I've got a whole empty stairway already set up, where my apothecary will be on the bottom floor, and my Death Knight on the top. Plan is to generally make a war room with personal rooms on the side, because this Tauren was a war leader in both life and death, and I'll be talking about that as I go through the building process here and share some of her backstory. And I'm really eager to get started, so I'm going to jump in right away by laying out some structure for this place before we get into the actual decorating. As we begin building here, I'm going to talk a little bit about Rokara's backstory, sort of the character behind this build. She was born many, many decades ago at a time when the Tauren tribes were much more scattered. They were dealing with the Centaur, they were warring with each other, and she was a member of the Grim Totem tribe, raised to be brutal in combat and bring carnage to the battlefield. She proved herself quite the exceptional warrior as she grew up, and soon found herself put in a position where she was leading a war band. Basic structuring in, it actually took a bit longer than it usually does to do this sort of thing, mainly because I had to go to Northrend and farm out some reagents to make this great. I'm trying to emulate sort of what you see in Icecrown Citadel and other undead areas where you'd have this grate that then you can see to a lower floor. I think that'll look really cool once my apothecary has her lab set up, because you'll be able to look down on all of that. But either way, it makes for a pretty nice aesthetic appearance. This may get changed in the future, but for now, I like how this looks. In general, this just took a bit because this room layout is complicated to work in. I'm trying not to duplicate my layouts too much, and if we go here, we could have ended up with a room very like this, with a centerpiece towards the back and along central corridor, since we're dealing with so many of these square stairwell rooms, but I'm pretty happy with this instead. It would have just been a little too narrow if we had it divvied up like that. I wouldn't be able to get the side rooms in, but this way, I can have an entrance that is pretty nice. With a door in here, you'll immediately clock onto this point of interest. For this war planning room, we got enough room on the sides. Then in these back two rooms, I feel like we actually have enough room for this to be a forge, a very like rune forge, Death Knight sort of thing. Then of course, as always, a bedroom, because I like to have rooms for my characters to actually live in. It's nice for them to have a bit more of a personal space. So it's a bit of a complicated room layout. Of course, we use the scaling walls trick that I learned in the last episode, where if you bind your scale buttons to hotkeys, you can actually scale items that can't be scaled, like these walls and pillars. And I think it looks pretty nice for a start. Now, I already had to go to Dalaran to Northrend to farm some reagents, but that is far from the last reagent farming we're going to have to do, because I'm punishing myself, and this Death Knight's build is going to require a whole bunch of crafted items to really come together in a way that I want. So I'm going to have to get on that, and once I'm back with you, we'll be ready to start on the actual building process. On the battlefield, she brought victory over and over and over again, claiming territory and resources for the Grim Totem in this dark time. She even earned the name Darkhorn, because though her horns were bone white, they'd become darkened by the blood of the battlefield. Very edgy stuff. That took forever. I really wish wood gathering was, maybe a profession like archaeology or something, and there was a way to improve it, because I actually cut myself off after a certain point. If I'd gone for all of the braziers that I wanted to get, I probably would have been at that for several more hours just gathering lumber, and then dealing with all the other profession stuff, getting professions leveled, getting the reagents for them. It's a lot of work to use any profession equipment, which is a shame, because some of the best decor, and especially some of the best sort of undead themed decor, comes from professions. But I finally got the braziers I want, the little runic tablets I want, the anvil, all that good stuff, and while I was out there, I actually had a realization, and that is that if I'm already going to be holding off on doing the horde section of the house, and we're getting an increased room budget in Midnight, there's no reason for me to be doing the empty stairwell rooms for these rooms right here. I can actually just go ahead and delete this, and then on the second floor, which we are, just use a small square room. And then similarly on the first floor, another small square room for my apothecary's lair, and now I'll lose the cool grate in the floor effect, but I wasn't totally sold on that anyway. Now I can save on decor budget on for the floor here. I have an easier room to work with just overall. The ceiling will be nicer. I can get flagstones down here, which will fit the theme much better. So all in all, it's just going to be a major improvement. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild the room layout that I had here, and start getting some of these sort of basic details in, and I'll get back to you when I'm done. Eventually, she came to challenge the leader of her sect of the Grim Totem tribe, and in combat, severed his head from his shoulders. taking over her sort of branch of it. During her time as leader, though, she ended up having a daughter who she trained in the same brutal combat tradition she had been training in, despite her daughter's inclination towards more peaceful and positive action. Perhaps it was no surprise then when, one day, her daughter challenged her for leadership of the tribe, and Rokara too had her head severed from her shoulders. So it's been about a week. I've been busy traveling and with work, but it's given me a lot of time to reflect on the build as it's coming together so far, and while I like what I've got going with this sort of war room and especially this custom throne, I'm getting the feeling of it being a little cramped and that things could be better. And as much as I wanted to avoid making another room, whether it's a sort of hallway down the middle and then rooms on the side, the way that the ceiling gets vaulted in a medium room like this kind of just lends itself to that, especially if I want to fit the throne in well. So I'm going to redo the layout of the room, possibly redo the throne, and then I've got a few other ideas to enhance this as we move back into the building phase. I'm liking this open layout a bit better. It's very Death Knight inspired, it's very Tauren inspired, but I still feel like there's something missing. Obviously I'm working in a constrained space, but I think I can do better. And I think in order to do better, I'm going to go take a look at Icecrown Citadel, Acaris, and some of the other Death Knight sort of Lich King-y locations, and sort of get a sense for what they have going on over there. Something I've noticed in a lot of Lich King and Death Knight spaces is they tend to have these very wide open sort of areas to the ground, and that could be really cool if I were to convert it back to that sort of two-story setup. The issue is then I wouldn't be able to use these sort of cobbled flooring, but maybe I could improvise something to make that work anyway. Yeah, we do see a lot of like open space here. You know, as we look into other areas, they are more denoted by scenery, it looks like. Well, like we've got plague barrels over here, and over here we've got stuff locked in frost, flames, that sort of thing. I wish we could get these braziers in the house so I wouldn't have to improvise something for that. Yeah, open spaces with sightlines blocked off by curtains that then determine the actual look in the space by what they have surrounding it. And then upstairs is pretty similar. It's less noticeable. I guess this is a fairly open forge area. I'm definitely going to be taking some inspiration from this section. And then the actual forges themselves get their own little sort of centerpieces. But okay, I think I'm getting a general feel. I'm getting some good inspiration out of this, some ideas of how I might be able to rework things. I'm going to go ahead though and head on over to Icecrown Citadel to take a look there. During ICC, what other fun things can we pick out here? Again, more of these cool braziers. That's why I wanted to farm up those brazier items. I knew that was a look that gets used a lot in these sort of Death Knight Lich King areas. Okay, let's brainstorm some things. So if I wanted to make a hanging platform above my apothecary's lair, that could be cool. I also wanted a private chamber in my apothecary's lair too, but that could be done by making a connecting room in the back, and then I can focus the entire space just on the lair, which is probably a better way to do things. Then in the future, when I get increased room sizes, I can actually make my Tauren's room be to the size. Or maybe I even have the space. I guess if I go back to a empty stair, I'd have the space to make a like small sized room for my Tauren to actually have their chambers. And then I get to have a more interesting layout as well. Ooh, okay, this is interesting. Big central spire, again, that same thing of these like platforms where there's drops to down below. Lots of chains as well. Definitely gonna need to get some chains involved. I think that's a good idea. And then the frozen throne. I don't really need to look at this place, but I might as well just kill Arthas. I was actually looking at an image of this place to get inspiration. Again, you've got more circles. Big icicles, of course, the actual spire of the Frozen Throne itself. I don't think it would be that difficult to honestly build the Frozen Throne. This could essentially be made out of a bunch of different dyed cobble pieces, depending on the colors that you can get. which I might go for because it'd be kind of cool to have a miniature version of the Frozen Throne in my house. Okay, so after visiting a few of the more Death Knight inspired locations, I've realized a few things. Firstly, the actual best layout for this room is going to be the empty stairway I originally had. Then we can utilize the fact I had extra room budget to make side rooms to get the forge and stuff in there, while our main room we devote similarly to a throne room and a war planning table, but in a very sort of Acarus Ice Crown Citadel way, where we have it suspended in the air over my apothecary area where you'll be able to look down at her lab. I think that's going to look a lot better, and I also think it's going to just generally feel cooler all around, as well as honestly maybe even taking less budget than original plans had in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and scrap all of this, hopefully for the last time, and get started on trying to make that concept work. On her funeral bier, her corpse laid for some time, until the agents of the Lich King, seeking great warriors to raise into Death Knights, who had heard tell of the story of this vicious Tauren leader, found it, stole it away, and returned her to life. Now a member of the Ebon Blade, she served in much the same manner she had in life, as a brutal warrior and leader on the battlefield, carving her way through first the enemies of the Lich King, and then the forces of the Lich King when the Ebon Blade were later freed. As the years have gone on, she has on occasion pledged her axe towards the cause of the Horde, and when the time of Shadowlands came around, she was among those to invade the Maw in that ill-fated first incursion, was ultimately captured though she was not broken. Instead, she spent a great deal of time studying the domination magic that the Moorsworn used, and the runic magic of the Maldraxi, coming out of the Shadowlands with a great deal of knowledge that she then put towards forging rune blades and weapons for the Death Knight Order. So basic shape is really coming along nicely here. I was able to get these platforms looking really good. It's feeling like you get in places like Acarus and Icecrown Citadel, with this center platform that's just made out of slate cobbles. The war table is much more of a centerpiece now, with some good illumination. But all in all, it feels a lot more shape-wise interesting just on the whole. And also just generally in design and theme, it feels better. And there's still plenty of space down here, even though it dips into what would technically be this room to ultimately build the lab, which I think will look really good from above once we get to that. I'm gonna add some bookshelves in the corner here. You know, similar to the Death Knight Order Hall, it also would make sense for a war planning area for there to be bookshelves. It also helps close up some of the gaps in this fencing a little bit. This bookshelf has a really nice weathered look, and while we don't have the bookshelves in the Death Knight Order Hall available, I think this is a really good in-between compromise to get that sort of creepier feel. Those bookshelves in, it's annoyingly difficult to get war resources, even having played so much BFA. Hopefully that gets changed in the future. But now I'm going to try and build the Frozen Throne right over here, which is going to be interesting. Obviously it won't be exactly the Frozen Throne, more like something inspired by it, but I'm going to give it my best shot to add to the atmosphere of this place. Now she sees less time on the battlefield as Azeroth enters a more peaceful era where the Ebon Blade are less needed, but she ever thirsts for that glory, and so she has recently taken up work as a mercenary, pledging her knowledge and expertise in battle to various causes that might have need of her, particularly in the undead circles. As the void rises in midnight, Rakara will surely turn her axe towards assisting the elves in this effort, bringing her dark magic to once more counter dark magic in turn. So I've got the throne in now, and I'm really liking how it's looking. The ambient light I was able to get by hiding this up here, and then the way that the underlighting is provided by these pyres really makes for a very eerie feel. Definitely captures some of that Frozen Throne energy. And I'm thinking the usage of these cobbles to be ice might be something I actually implement in the rest of this build here. Possibly dropping these fences to go for a more icy look, making this more ice. I think it would help with cohesion and also some of the clutter that this build has going on. So I'm going to get right to that and try and just refine this area more in general. As a person, however, Rokara is pretty brutal and cold. She was very closed off to her emotions even in life, and death has done few things to help that, only adding to her vindictive and angry nature. But for all the rage that she carries within her heart, she knows strategy often wins the day more than might, and she knows to surround herself with the right people to enable that. As a part of the Grim Totem tribe, she's a big believer in might makes right, and that the strongest should be the ones to lead. Okay, so I did some reworking, further emphasizing the frost feeling. Of course, we got cobblestone paths that have been dyed to sort of hide the wood elements of these walkways, and again, just add that icy feel. I felt like just having this fully exposed without the fences was a bit off, so I added these chunks of ice to then serve as a sort of barrier and separate this place from the rest of the build a little bit more as the central war planning area. Back here, I got rid of the overlooking forges and just made it so that the braziers are more hidden, and I think it actually works a lot better that way. You get similar ambience, but it feels less cluttered and emphasizes the throne a lot more, which you can in fact sit on, of course. And then I also went ahead and built the forge. In our research, we found that usually Death Knight places cover off areas with curtains, and this is really the best solution that I found for that. I dyed it Nazjatar Navy because it's really similar to the Ebon Blade banners, which helps with the cohesion of the whole build. And then the forge itself. It's a really simple build, but I really like how it came out nonetheless. Of course, we've got the actual Ebon Blade forge item here, but then we're again using these signal braziers, hiding them in to almost look with these trophies from the Hunter Order Hall to then sort of recreate how the forge looks in the Legion version of Acheris, where you can go inspect your artifact weapon. And I think it just makes for a really good energy of the place. And then without going too crazy or too over budget, we've got clutter around, weapons, a rack where tools would be kept, this sort of thing, which is for a bit of that Maldraxxus flash, since she did study from the Necrolords as well. And then of course this nice anvil from Wrath of the Lich King in the center. Again, more runes, and surprisingly there aren't many anvil items in the game, at least not ones that really fit the theme, and this one does it really well. I especially like when you come down here, you can see it lit from below, and this whole area framed by the curtains, but hiding some of it just makes for a very enticing build. With a final room here, and that will be for Rokara's bedroom. It's going to be interesting building a Tauren bedroom. You don't really see a whole lot of those in the game. I might do a little bit of a hybrid thing, but I've got a few ideas and I'm just going to get right to it. So I may have made a mistake. I went and looked at some Tauren zones and it's made me want to rework things all over again. But it's not just that. As much as I'm liking this sort of like Acheris, Icecrown Citadel direction, it's also just not quite working, and I think that's because you can't really capture a lot of that energy when you're dealing with these housing interiors that use wood. Because wood is a building material that is almost entirely absent from Acheris and the like, and so attempting to replicate that style is almost a merging and mashing of two disparate styles, and it makes this feel pretty hollow and pretty empty. So I think if I go for that Tauren-inspired direction, go back to what I was initially going for, just rework it a little bit, keep it a 2-story room like this because you actually get much more ceiling space by doing that. I think I'm going to be able to make something a lot better. So hopefully this will actually be the final rework, but I've really enjoyed the building process and trying out these different designs, and I hope even if we don't ultimately go with a certain design, that maybe it can inspire you and maybe it can be something that you end up using. For now I'm just going to scrap this and we're going to get a central room reworked here. Despite all of this very brutal, cold attitude, there is a more sentimental side to her. At times she does still think of her days amidst the Tauren, the shamanistic practices they held. She usually tries to avoid that by throwing herself into ruthless combat so she doesn't have to think about it, but it's one of those things that haunts her in those quiet moments. So that's Rokara. She's a really fun character who I haven't got to do a whole lot with, and I'm looking forward to doing more with in the future. And I think this build has been perfectly capturing both that sentimental Tauren aspect of carrying forth that glory from her old days, having trophies around that might have come from various conquests, and the Death Knight Runeforge aspect with this forge on the side, and the war planning table in the middle, and of course, our own frozen throne. I look forward to maybe hosting some war planning meetings with my guild in the future here come midnight, but that will have to wait for when the expansion is actually upon us. So we are finally, after much back and forth as you saw, done here. I was able to capture a lot more of the energy I initially was trying to go for, and I was able to avoid some of my worries about the layouts being too similar, getting the second story look in here. Obviously this is a huge change since I last checked in, but a lot of the elements have stayed the same. We've got the same war planning table, the same throne, same sort of forge setup over here, but they've just been arranged in different ways. So I use this raised platform with these Orgrimmar interior walls to create a stony area, which was an issue I was having with this very wooden floor, to create this separated forge area, further separated out with this Forsaken War planning tent, again using some of the sort of drape separation that we saw happening in Acheris. Otherwise, it's not too different from the entirely different room that we had set up initially. Approach to the throne is a touch different. I really like the use of these banners. This is something that I saw in Tauren buildings where they'd have banners hanging from upper floors, and I think this is a great spot for them. This is our like primary source of light, and it's pretty low down, but given that it's meant to be illuminating the war planning table, I think that works pretty nicely. Although really these braziers don't do a whole lot to illuminate stuff, unfortunately. Because I would have loved to get like an eerie blue feeling like I have the green down in here. But that just isn't something that's really easy to do with our current lighting system. And then of course you can sit in our makeshift frozen throne, and I think she looks great in it. But in this back section, getting to get double use out of this Maldraxian rune tablet. We've got a sort of simple office. You know, she made the mistake of getting too good at her job, so now she has to do a bunch of paperwork for all the various Ebon Blade stuff and her own war and mercenary efforts. So just generally Death Knight knowledge and a desk at which she can do her work. And then just some general Tauren decoration. That's something I have in a few spots throughout the build. I've got it over here as well. In a lot of the Tauren buildings I saw, they just will have rugs about, they'll have decoration about. It doesn't really seem too purposeful, but it does add to an overall aesthetic and feeling, which when we're trying not to escalate our budgets with a bunch of crazy builds, it helps to just throw a few smaller props around to sort of create a feel more than make a space that is truly cluttered. We reserve our clutter for higher detail areas like here in the office. But in the upstairs section, I left it rather plain, and that is very intentional because Rokara is a Death Knight, and Death Knights in my mind are living weapons. They don't really keep a whole lot of comforts, so I've just got a punching bag for her to train with, some Tauren banners to sort of remember and celebrate her time as a Tauren. I like to think that maybe some of these acclaimed war banners from her time as a war leader, and then a sort of bed. Looking around at Tauren locations and architecture, you really don't see beds, at least not in the traditional sense. I get the sense that they sleep on mats a lot, so that's just sort of what I went for here, a nice big mat. Obviously, she's not going to be doing any sleeping, but if she ever has anyone around, probably good to have. And then this story frame, I like to think or picture that this is a story telling her sort of deeds on the battlefield and the sort, one of the trophies that she's kept from life. A few sentimental things, was though Rokara is very cold and would like to portray herself as this pure warrior who's just seeking glory on the battlefield, she does have those touches of sentiment that show that she's a little bit more than that than she'd like to let on. But all in all, for how harrowing this build was, how many times I scrapped it, how much I reworked it, how long it ended up taking because of that, I'm really happy with the end result. It didn't come out how I initially envisioned it, but that's because how I initially envisioned it wasn't gonna work, and that's just how things are gonna work out sometimes. Today, I'm actually going to go ahead and, much like in the last episode, redo this build. Because I do love it and love how it turned out, especially after all the trials and tribulations to get to this point, but I realized something. When I went through and I looked at Icecrown Citadel and Acheris and all these other locations for inspiration, I picked up on a lot of things. I picked up on chains, metal elements, skulls, all sorts of different motifs. But one thing I seemed to miss out on was a sense of scale. All of those places are huge and open in a way that I've honestly been avoiding in housing so far. One of my main critiques when I see other people's houses is that their rooms are too big and they ultimately feel empty. Something that I've tried to make a goal when building the house is even for larger rooms, I've tried to make it so that the space is cluttered and there's things dividing them up, because in real life, you very rarely see places that people actually live in be wide open. But the thing with Death Knights is they don't really live there. They're more like bases of operations. Icecrown Citadel is itself a citadel. It's meant to be a grand, glorious palace, not a place that people live. And there's another thing I realized. As you might have noticed, we've got this green glowing up through the floor. And that's because I've been doing some testing down in my apothecary's lab for builds I might want to do. I have this half-constructed Legion mech I really like, and it's looking great, but an issue I've sort of been able to avoid so far in my empty stairway rooms is that you get a lot of light bleed with platforms. And having this green glowing up through, especially since it will eventually be all over the build, just isn't going to cut it. So we're going to kill two birds with one stone here. We're going to make a proper Death Knight Sanctum that I'm really happy with, feel really inspired by. I've already done some testing and I know this is going to look really great. And we're going to make it so that we're in a good position to work on our Apothecary's Lair in the future. Say one final goodbye to this build, which I hope you all enjoyed the look of. And then we're going to go into our housing menu and delete it. I feel pretty confident here in just putting a square room medium right here. Now this is obviously a huge space, but again, we're going for scale here. The vaulted ceiling looks really nice. It looks like some of the chambers that you find around Icecrown Citadel, although we are going to have to keep it on Folk Dark, unfortunately, because as much as I do love that sort of more Orgrimmar aesthetic for this build, the red tarping here really doesn't fit. I wish there were a way to change the color on it. And either way, the sort of great hole fill you get out of here works really well anyway. And then the floor gets to be flagstone. Again, perfect for that Icecrown feel. And it's going to help us a lot more with the forge, as we're going to have to use a lot fewer custom assets. So this is going to be our baseline. And I'm going to try and make it so that we can get that forge in, get private areas, get a war room, and I think in this space it's going to feel a lot more like things are just shoved in super cramped, because we were essentially building 3 rooms in a space really only designed for 1 or 2. But in order to get started on all of that, I'm going to need to hop on some characters that I had back in Legion, which I have all set up for order resource farming, and I have to go around, do a few world quest sweeps, and get a bunch of order resources, because I have a lot of Legion decor in mind for this. So I mainly wanted to grab order resources so that I could get more Death Knight decor. I've already got a pretty good collection, but you know, just in case I wanted to end up using more in the build. Then the next thing I needed to do was level up enchanting, with some of the items I've seen in these undead areas come from classic enchanting. Unfortunately, a lot of these classic recipes require quite the grind of these old reagents, so I ended up having to spend a bunch of time running around getting essences of undeath and dark runes, and I was able to finally get these items. Before I get started in this room, I want to show some of the locations that are inspiring me to get a refresher, and also show what I have in mind, and talk a little about the idea I have for the build. Some of the places that I'm going to be drawing inspiration from is again Icecrown, but from a different location than the actual citadel itself. When I was flying around here the other day, I realized that there are these really cool, like, grand halls. I'd seen these before, of course, but I hadn't actually considered them for a housing build. And this one especially has this forge towards the back, where you can see it's very wide open, and not a lot of stuff is actually filling the space, but it's just lends to this grand, indomitable sense. The roof is even shaped sort of like the roof in the housing room that we've picked out. But it just has this format of a thin, narrow hallway that leads to a centerpiece of focus, and then side areas that are more specialized. And then on the outside, they usually have a bunch of props stacked around that, You know, lending further inspiration like weapon racks, plague barrels. I wish we could get some of these fancy wagons and stuff. These areas as well is something that I'm going to be definitely taking inspiration from. I really like these tent setups. This is actually something you also see within Acarus, are these sort of tents. Unfortunately, we can't get these exact models, but I like the idea of, you know, if she's supposed to be a war leader, she'd have something like this around. And then another one of these halls. This one, especially, I really like with this grand table. Especially since I want a war planning table, having something like this within these book areas, I think is a really good idea. We also see a lot of usage of these braziers, which are something you can actually get right now. They just take a fair few resources. And then outside we have these blue versions of the braziers. It would be really cool if there's a bunch of items like this in the game that have multiple versions of the same object but with different particles. If we could use the customization menu to change what type of particles they're emitting. I'm just hoping we can get a lot of the objects that Blizzard used in housing, because these skulls on the wall or these braziers, there's so many cool items in the game that just aren't available to players. And then back to Acarus, revisiting our forge areas to get more sort of inspiration. You get a lot of traditional forge elements. I need to be more okay with using stuff like these where, you know, it's orange fire and I always picture Death Knights as being associated with blue, especially her, but it just fits the forge so much better. And similarly, I was talking about tents. We've got a few different variants around here to keep in mind. Just little, places, hanging cages and stuff. And so I think with this refresher, I'm ready to head back and get started on the actual build. Following along from the inspiration here, the general idea is to set up these pillars to make a great hall like we saw in those halls in Icecrown, and then I'm going to focus on the forge here first. Similarly to the forge build we had previously, I'm putting the big soul forge in the center and also just filling it with clutter all around, getting that anvil in place, crates, all that good stuff to really make this feel like a whole space. Okay, so I've just got the basic structure and the forge in here, and I think it's already looking really good. Haven't got the chains for these braziers yet, but those will come later. The forge is pretty similar to how we have it before, although with this large room space, I've been able to ramp up the size on these Hunter Order Hall trophies, and I think that really helps frame it, accentuate it a lot more, ramp up the size on the forge as well, and all in all capture that feeling that I was seeing in those great halls and in Acarus itself. I think something that increasing room size has allowed me to do is really scale things up to a Tauren scale. If there's going to be a Tauren space, things need to be Tauren size like this anvil. And then I've got like weapon racks around, similarly to how they were placed in places like Acarus. It's basic for now, but I'm trying not to go too overboard immediately because I don't want to spend a bunch of budget doing something and then have to scrap it back later. So instead, I'm going to pivot over to this area, start working on our sort of training and makeshift tent barracks section, and then we'll see how things go from there. Once again, using inspiration from Acarus and Icecrown, I want to make a sort of barracks using a bunch of tents about, just like we see in Acarus. I think that fits this war leader theme really well. Definitely need to get a training ground in there between the tents. She can look out over on the training. Then of course we can make a personal area for Rikara in this big tent and use it as a sort of office. It actually took a bit of back and forth trying to work out just how big to make this tent, how to fit it in, whereabouts on the office, but we ultimately decided with a very private internal tent area with the office actually on the outside, which is something you do see at a lot of war camps. Have those sort of dyed cobblestones to get blood around, and really make this area feel like a sort of war camp on the side. Fiddling around with this for a bit with a couple of hours to go farm up some decor pieces from crafting that I actually didn't ultimately end up using, but we might use them in the future, probably below in the apothecary's lab. But in any case, what I do have cooking I'm really happy with. Of course, taking inspiration from those tents we saw around the very Lich King, Wrath areas. I've got these 3 smaller tents around. When they give the ability to put warband characters in housing, I'd love to just make some throwaway Death Knights to have around here. Just a simple, almost makeshift barracks planning area. pretty light on decor, but with the items that we're using, it still ends up feeling fairly cluttered. And then in the middle here is a training area. And this kind of pulls in the center training area in Acheris, also the Blood Death Knight area, especially with this table, which, we could have abomination parts and the like on there, cages hanging about, stockades, more weapons, and this punching bag that also doubles as a sort of training dummy. Of course, in the center area, we also use these royal red dyed cobblestones to make it look like blood splatters, another thing that we see in Acheris. And then Rakara's sort of office, war chest of sorts, a desk behind which she can sort of meet with the people under her command, speak with any visitors she might have, tomes as well, martial techniques, that sort of thing. And then the very large tent dominating this back corner here, clearly her personal tent, especially given she's a Tauren, she needs a big one. We come inside and it's sort of like the upstairs in the previous room that we had for her, where it's a rug with pillows. I am of the opinion that Tauren don't really use beds. We don't really see beds in a lot of Tauren architecture like in Thunderbluff. They usually have mats down, so a little bit of that old Tauren flair. I much prefer, however, using this mat and these pillows to instead get that Death Knight element in there. And weapons close by, but she is of course always ready for a fight. But all in all, I'm extremely happy with this side area. This is something I wasn't quite sure if it was going to work out, but it's worked out amazingly. And so far, I'm feeling a lot more confident in this build than I was in the previous one at this point. I think that we're capturing the essence of this Death Knight stronghold that I wanted to perfectly. And now we turn to the final section here. I've already started laying out some test lighting, as we're going to build our war planning area. So off the bat, I wanted to try a really long war table like I saw in that one hole in Icecrown, but it ultimately just didn't really feel right, and so I went back to that Acheris inspiration, instead using the Acheris command table. And with that idea, I realized Acheris has a big ritual circle around its command table, and there is an item kind of like that in the game, and that is the Draenei Hollow Dais, which meant I needed to go to Outland and level my Outland enchanting and gather up some lumber so that I could craft a few to use in the build. But once I had it in there, it really started to come together. I decided to bump it into the back corner just for it to be a bit more closed off, hide it with a curtain and stuff, since it felt a bit weird in the center and I couldn't work out what to put in that back corner otherwise. And then I recently pre-ordered the new Diablo 4 expansion, so I got housing decor. I wish it wasn't tied to stuff like pre-orders or the shop, but it makes for a really great centerpiece to tie with this whole war planning thing. But that really left one section to try and fill out, because things were feeling pretty empty at this point, and I tried a number of things, the wagons especially, but I just couldn't get anything quite working the way I wanted to, until I decided to attempt to build this obelisk again with a ritual circle around it, and this really worked. It fits the theme super well. It's similar to stuff that we saw when we were finding inspiration, and it all tied together really nicely. We're all finished up here now with that left side and the build on the whole. There were some tweaks elsewhere, and I am very happy with it. So let's just start with the left side, go section by section. I made this sort of altar using Ironforge fence posts and the Dark Master's brazier for this really cool sort of Necromancer Scourge energy, and then this Draenei Hollow Dais on the floor to act as a sort of ritual circle with, meat and carcasses about. I figure for, they use this for summoning and empowering undead as part of the Death Knight order. Then over here, we've got a chess set. I am a big nerd and I know the history of wargaming and how war planning tied into that, so I picture it as a sort of Kriegspiel-esque game where it is much more of a battle simulator than just simple chess, and is basically just to fill the space along with these sort of storage side items. Then coming to the war room proper, we've got another Draenei Hollow Dais, and I hid a lantern inside of this so that it looks like purple light is being cast off from the dais as the sort of cool underlighting you get in this section. Books around, of course, for, war tomes, strategies, that sort of thing. And then back in the middle area for the final tour. Not a whole lot has changed here. I decided to move some objects around. We got this grinding wheel in, which I think is great for that forge aesthetic. A bathtub, which I'm using as a quenching pool. That's another thing that we saw in Acheris. And then here has changed a fair bit. So I got rid of the table here, mostly for budget reasons, but also it felt kind of out of place with having a war planning section over here. And things were a bit cluttered, so we've spread out more of the training areas now, emphasized more of this sort of, I guess, torture or undead crafting area, and then shifted some things around in Rokara's office a little bit. I put also the queen piece from the chess set down here because, you know, she is the queen. Makes sense, probably a gift from one of her troops. Also, I think putting these banners up here, it has a similar effect and it's a great spot for them, really makes this feel like a proper war hall and emphasizes the central corridor. You know, with these big rooms, creating separate areas is something that's sort of important, and even though I want to keep that open grand space, distinguishing the differences between the places with these simple banners does have a really good effect. But overall, I think this is a massive improvement over what we had before. Before, the aesthetics were sort of clashing, it felt super cramped. It didn't quite feel like the undead spaces I was being inspired from, but now it just feels perfect with that style emulating both the Scourge and Acaris aesthetics. All these different places, each of which can work as a really nice hub for roleplay in the future, and still maintaining an even better private area than I had before. I'm really happy with how it turns out, and with pre-patch coming soon and increases to budgets on both decor and housing rooms, I'm excited to play around more with large rooms. This has been a bit of an experiment in keeping a large room with an open concept, which was something I was unsure about, and I think it's worked wonderfully. I think I will be doing more of that going forward where it makes sense. With that, let's venture downstairs into the sort of basement section of our undead tavern, go through this secret door, into this now empty room for what will finally be this character's laboratory. As you can see, I've already laid out the room some, and I've discovered something pretty helpful. One of the reasons that I've liked using empty stairway rooms is they get this really high vaulted ceiling. But it turns out if you set your ceiling style to generic, rather than something like folk medium, you actually get that fully raised ceiling. And the first thing I'm going to do is something I actually previewed a little in the previous episode, and that is going to be this hanging, partially constructed Legion mech, because Siobhan is a huge fan of the Burning Legion and its war machines, and I think she would absolutely have one that she's working on fixing up hanging about. It's going to be a bit of a kit-bashed build, and I'm very excited to see what I can do with it. So the pieces I was using for this were already pretty solid. I had this war map, and then also the Dreadscar map to serve as a sort of leg. With this at some odd angles so that it actually looks like it's hanging. The design that this is based on is the mount that you can get from Hellfire Citadel Mythic. This torch works really nicely for an arm, I think. Like a more long arm that you'd use for actually interacting with objects rather than an arm that's like what we'll have on the other side, which would be more like a cannon sort of thing. And then I was using a chest, sort of like a crutch chassis thing. That looks so good. It looks like it's actually aiming out to shoot at us. It's perfect. Using this map as like the centerpiece works wonders because it gives it eyes, which really helps personify it in this sort of robotic sense. Then I'm going to of random chunk around its base. I want a way to actually walk up to it to make it look like she's actually working on it and it's not just sitting here. So using the same shelf trick that we used outside in our undead area to make a ladder of sorts. Oh my gosh, this is perfect. I'm so happy right now. I've been thinking about this build for so long, and it's already starting to come together so much nicer than I could have imagined. Oh my goodness, yes. Is it possible to parkour up into it? Oh, maybe I should absolutely, what am I saying? Maybe I should put a chair in there. Absolutely, there should be a chair in here so she can actually sit in it. Fortunately, she doesn't sit in it at an angle, but this is amazing. One of those builds that when you finish it, you just gotta jump around it for a little bit because holy shit, it turned out perfectly. I think it's looking amazing. So we're going to start off and actually go and grab some of the hidden artifact appearances that I've been missing in order to get a couple things from the Demon Hunter and Warlock Order Halls before we move on to grabbing stuff from Mechagon and then finally doing our professions. As we get into building here, I want to talk about Siobhan and her history. As a child, she was fairly lonely because she grew up without a father. He had left before she was born, and her mother passed away of illness shortly after. Okay, so I grabbed those hidden appearances. It was actually pretty easy, and now I've come to Mechagon. This is where you can get a ton of cool mechanical decor that I might want to use, and I've been meaning to collect it for experience anyway. Shiv's best company were her books, left to her by her grandfather. In them, she researched all sorts of different herbs, alchemy, and the like, became quite the accomplished alchemist, eventually ending up as a member of Lordaeron's Alchemy Society. There she researched and grew her skills, and while her contemporaries were concerned with stuff like immortality and turning lead to gold, she was more concerned with the making of the universe. It actually did end up going faster than expected, but only because back in BFA I had an alliance side old I played really heavily and got too exalted with Mechagon, did a bunch of content with them, and so she actually had a ton of resources left over that at some point I must have sold or just gotten rid of to make bank space on my main. So I was able to just buy at least one of everything and a couple extras. Hopefully I don't need too much more, but we're making good progress on all the grinding. Now I just need to go grab some vendor decor that I have in mind, and then we have to get into crafting, which is going to be interesting. And it was this larger interest that led her into acquiring a skull from an adventurer that belonged to a demon, a skull which began talking to her and sharing all sorts of knowledge about the Burning Legion, its infinite armies. While this should have frightened Siobhan, it instead excited her. But before the Kirin Tor could crack down on her, the Third War happened and she was raised into undeath. Now she could fully throw herself into demonic research, summoning demons and becoming a more powerful warlock, while lending her aid to the Royal Apothecary Society under Putris. But I have gathered a ton of decor. You can see some of the crafted items actually sitting in my bags. I like to do it this way so that if I don't end up needing all of the items that I crafted, I can always sell the excess on the auction house. But before I start putting all of this day's work to actual use, I'm going to take a look at some of my inspiration spots and also talk about some of my general inspiration outside of the game to get a refresher, get the ideas percolating in my mind as we get into the building phase. Firstly, having a look at the Warlock Order Hall. This is something that I'd already seen, but this sort of voidy summoning circle, this is what we needed the hollow dices and a few of the other items for. Now that right there is a piece of decor I wish I could have, a big bound up Pit Lord. In this training area, I really like the powered up cages, but this area, and that actually reminds me I need to grab these sheer curtains, is definitely something I want to have in mind for like the bedroom area of the build. This gateway is something as well that I'm heavily considering trying to recreate in some way. Sort of, I'm torn between if I want my demon summoning area to take after these things or if I want it to be more like a Legion Fell Gate, because either are ones that she would definitely have in her lair. That was just a start, and there's another area I'm turning to for inspiration, and that is these sort of old school undead zones and the labs in there. I was actually looking at this one the other day. The shelving in particular is something that's really inspiring. Though these bottles about. But on the topic of laboratories, it actually makes me think of some other references I have in mind. And obviously I've mentioned Arcane a few times before in these videos as being an inspiration for this build overall. And one of the places that I'm taking inspiration from is, of course, Singe's laboratory, with the way it has these big bottles around. It's all sort of lit by his experiments. Similarly style of the tables, lots of pipes around. Something I really want to do with this build is link everything with pipes and make it feel like a living, breathing structure that is as much a construction as Siobhan herself is. I'm also a big fan of the show She-Ra, and particularly Entrapta is an inspiration for Siobhan from that show. And I love the whole sequence of episodes and moments that she has with Hordak in his laboratory. Again, it's similar where it has these big vitrines around, vials of fluid with experiments and stuff, lots of scrap metal, all different in-progress experiments and technology. And all of this, even though it's more old school, it still has a lot of charm and a lot of things that fit the sort of aesthetic and energy I'm trying to provide really nicely. Just a shame we can't get whatever this thing is as a piece of decor. With all that inspiration fresh in the mind, it is time to get building here. The next thing I'm going to do is make her workstation right next to it over here. When Putris ultimately sided with the Legion and decided to attempt to overthrow Sylvanas, Siobhan sided with him, and in the aftermath of that, she ended up losing her arm when she had to use a blight bomb to escape the Alliance and Horde forces in Undercity. For years, she lived as a fugitive while her body rotted from the side effects of that blight bomb. But she was not going to give up on herself. She sought out a means to save her body, and with the help of that skull she had acquired so long ago, she learned of the homunculi that the Legion employed, and in learning this she sought to create one. She set her body within it and bound her soul to its core, awakening to find a new form that was quite odd, but one that was quite welcome. When the Legion invaded once more, Siobhan actually was brought into their ranks. They sought her out with her connections to demonic magic until the Black Harvest was able to capture her and eventually convert her back to the side of Azeroth. In the aftermath of her time with the Black Harvest, she found her way back into War Chief Sylvanas' ranks. Of course, that too didn't work out so great, as she became a fugitive once more for a time until the Desolate Council was formed and clemency was granted by Apothecary Farinel for folks who had been loyal to Sylvanas to return. Where in the build am I right now? That's right, I'm in the pipes. So I may have let this very simple workstation get away from me a little bit, but this build has just been flowing so well. What I did here was use the Arathi bar shelving with a Acarus work table in front to get this nice cluttered look and make it into a proper desk, hide some of these apothecary cabinets in back to further enhance that undead and again, apothecary look of course. And then I've been using these plague canisters from Wrath in a few spots. Something I'm really happy with is that I put these chess pieces from the Diablo pre-order floating in them, because when you see these around in game, they're not usually empty, they usually have stuff floating, and what's a good scientific vitrine without some odd, creepy objects floating inside? Of course, any good apothecary needs ingredients, so I've got this Stormwind Trellis with some nice greenery and plants placed on it to add to that, and also these spices and powders about. Easy cauldron for brewing. And as I said, I was in the pipes, so I've got pipes running all around the build like I wanted, and I think it does a ton to enhance this sort of mad scientist aesthetic. I've used the Blightfire candles to give an effect that they're sort of leaking and dripping down, and then dyed cobblestones on the floor to make puddles of whatever they're leaking. You know, I might not be able to get a big fleshy tentacle thing to spit out green sludge, but a pipe will do. And then it's all coming out of this big fell pool that I imagine she went through a ritual to sort of bubble up, kind of like how the Hand of Gul'dan was formed. And we've used this Mechagon, I think it's called a recalibration or recycling machine, to give the sense of a pump. And if you listen to the audio here, it actually makes clicking and whirring noises to add ambience that further just ties this whole build together. So far I am loving it, as you can probably tell by how much I built since I last checked in. We still have a couple things left. I'd like to get a bedroom in for Shiv, although maybe I just leave it at the lab and be happy with that. And I also need areas for her to summon the demons, imprison them, all that good stuff. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to lay it out, so I'm just going to start placing things, see what happens. Though she has remained largely independent and by herself, focusing on her own research and her own utilization of demonic technology and magic. With the void arising come midnight, it's likely that she'll delve into researching the Void Storm in particular, this new realm of roiling darkness that would greatly fascinate her. The portal is in now, and I fiddled with a few different designs. I went for that traditional ritual circle with the sort of pillars that we saw in the Warlock Order Hall, but ultimately I did decide on that more Legion-inspired big green portal with a frame like this. And then we've got this Legion communicator. I figured that she's tapping into Legion communication lines, contacting demons, summoning them through the portal before imprisoning them. Of course, we've got cages around for just that purpose, some more sort of fell-ish blood and, drips from the pipes up above. And something that I think is really cool and really adds to this effect is that this altar, from getting a hidden warlock appearance, is actually interactable, and when you interact with it, this thing rises from it. The idea that it's meant to be a portal to a Legion world, it's almost like something is emerging out of it when we interact with it, and I think it looks so great and adds so much to the build. I also added a couple of mechanical objects near our Legion war machine, just things that add a bit more motion to the build and a bit more idea of this mechanical robotic work in progress area. They also have ambience, which further enhances the sensation of this lab. There is one thing left, as I'm sure you've noticed this door. A currently very sparse bedroom that I have about 21 budget left to finish. So it won't be anything too fancy, but it makes sense for Shiv not to have anything too fancy. She's very obsessed with her work and her science, so this is where the focus should be. But there is actually some nice decor that I want to farm, which I think will really help enhance this area. And we're going to try and make it look as pretty as we can in that final budget. And then we'll be able to call this whole space done. So I forgot to record like half this build, but we are done here with our little bedroom inspired by that succubus area of the Warlock Order Hall. And I do really like how it came out, especially these drapes. The Grand Drape of the Exiles, I think, is one of the most underrated decor items right now. Has this sheer pattern, you can walk right through it, beautiful purple color. And then of course we've got, classic Warlock succubus stuff, torment implements around, and just various relics, and of course probably Shiv's actual bed here, this coffin in that classic undead style. And while I really like this place and the fact that I was able to capture some of the energy from the Order Hall, it just feels a bit sparse, and that's because I'm pretty much maxed out on my budget. I could only get a couple more props in if I wanted to. And to even get to this point, I had to remove some elements elsewhere in the build. But I don't think I'm ultimately going to keep this, and the reason for that is because it just doesn't entirely fit Shiv. She's not the sort of person who would sleep or have something like this room, because she's so focused on her craft and her alchemy and engineering, all that sort of stuff, that she would basically not sleep. She barely slept even when she was alive, and I'd much rather put any budget that would go into trying to make a room like this work in a limited remaining budget into this space instead. So I'm going to get rid of that room, put a final few finishing touches on this area, and then I'll get back to you when the build is finally done. Though at the end of the day, Siobhan is not some scheming megalomaniac. She actually is primarily motivated by the acquisition of knowledge and research. It is her life, and she finds herself aligned with people who are typically on the more bad side, not because she wishes to do bad purely, but because they often have the morals and the resources that allow her to do the sort of research that other places would want her to slow down with. She has a great deal of difficulty understanding people, and in that way tends to prefer the company of her own demons. She just doesn't entirely get the whole friend thing. But she's extremely smart and she's quite fun, and I can't wait to get to roleplay more with her in the future. This lab that I've designed for her has perfectly captured her mad scientist personality, and I think it's going to be awesome to get to use it for just that. And with that, we are done at our full 2050 out of 2050 budget. For now, at least, at the time of the recording this, the pre-patch is tomorrow, and that will bring more housing levels and more budget to make more rooms in this house, but I am super happy with what we were able to finish off with the last of our budget. Didn't change much layout-wise, but did throw some more details around. We got this banner in, cage, and a cauldron hanging from the ceiling like we saw in those undead zones. Nice banner of the Black Harvest here. And then this area I shifted some things around. I ended up using this saw that I crafted to make a sort of mechanical workbench. So now we've got both an alchemy area and an area for her engineering side. This crane moves in a really fun way where it looks like it's picking up the junk over here and then putting it on the workbench for use. As you can just see there, perfect timing. And then I also used the opportunity to put a fair few little details around. We've changed the book layout here, through another one in this corner, through one into the back here to cover up what was essentially empty space. Put some crates and barrels all around. Another book here, of course, more trash in this cool motion crate as well. I also added these Draenei hollow dioces in front of the alchemy area to serve as sort of alchemy circles for rituals and transmutation of objects. But all in all, I think that this build has turned out amazingly. When I initially had the concept for it, I wasn't sure just how much I'd really be able to make it feel like a proper mad alchemist's mechanical laboratory, but all in all, I'm extremely happy with this build. It's a perfect fit for Siobhan and her story, which I hope you enjoyed learning about. With this build complete, though, we are officially done with our house, at least until the release of pre-patch, which does come out tomorrow, and will add more housing levels, more budget. We have a horde section in the future, and so we're far from done. Today, the pre-patch has finally been released, so I'm going to head outside and make use of that new Silvermoon exterior in a build that I actually already did. I did this on a live stream the day of the pre-patch, thanks to everyone who showed up, and we entirely redid our exterior in the process. So I'm going to throw up a little time lapse and go over the process of building all of this, what my thoughts were and goals were, and then after that, since it's episode 10 and I pretty much capped out on my budget prior to the pre-patch, I'm going to give you all a house tour of everything we've built so far, along with some of the lore I have behind the build. First thing I did was put together an elven exterior. I wanted it to match the interior, so that meant a fireplace on the left, and then I also wanted it to feel sort of palatial with these rising towers, gradually increasing the scale and splendor of the build. Then I decided to try something that I had originally had in my plans for the build, where I tiled the entire yard, which took a lot of work, but it created this really interesting patio canvas to work with. And from there, it was a matter of filling it, and I did some shaping on it first to give it proper entrances and exits, some more interesting edges, and just generally make it a nicer looking shape, using bushes to cover up some gaps without spinning decor. Then I had the idea to do this long sort of reflecting pool, partially inspired by Egyptian gardens that typically have these very classical fountain pools with these big plants on the side. Now this took a lot of dyed cobbles and sort of fiddling around with them, placing them. I used different colors to get a water effect where they have a sort of shiny side and a darker side. And then on the edge I put plants. These new clusters I think make for great aquatic plants to accentuate this look, but it wasn't quite working how I wanted, and that's because it wasn't in a great spot, so I ended up moving it over. This is actually something that happened a few times with this build. It required a fair bit of moving to get to a good spot, but I found this fountain made for a great head of this build. Again, more moving required though to ultimately get it into a good position. But once it was there, I used some inspiration from Silvermoon and put this nice seating table area both as a meeting spot and as a little viewing area for the fountains. And then this back corner wasn't working. I couldn't work out something to fill it with, so I got rid of the platform for the budget and turned this pagoda into a side area attached to the house, accentuating its shape, also serving as a meeting room. And then I got to work on the monk area, recreating what we had in our initial build with that same fountain look, although this time using cobbles, which is a lot nicer on the budget, a back area sort of shady and secluded with the bell and weapons for training, and then just exposing the fountain for the waterfalls. It looks great anyway. Finally, in this balcony, I made another meeting area. So I hope you all enjoyed that insight into my building process. We retained our monk area from before the pre-patch, except it looks even nicer now. I really like this fountain and how it gives it this sort of old school rustic Pandaren look. You see a lot of these like older designs with moss and leaves around. We've got some lovely little private areas for roleplay, like in this pagoda, and then flying up here, up in this balcony area, which is something really cool you can do with the Blood Elf builds. And then, of course, the centerpiece being a very fancy garden fountain area, more seating for roleplay with a great view of the fountains like we had originally, but now this excellent water feature. I am super happy with how this build turns out. It really fits our new elven exterior and its palatial energy with this refined garden. And while I might toy with it some more going forwards, as you can see I already swapped out these corners, realizing there were these round pieces. I think for now that this is where I'm going to call it, and we'll probably focus on an exterior build for my Alliance house in the future. But with this exterior, it's now time for a tour. So firstly, some lore. This house is built in my guild neighborhood. The guild that I'm in is this sort of Cult of the Forgotten Shadow undead based role-playing guild. And in our lore, we've recently been attacked in the undead lands and decided rather than continue endangering them, we would make use of the new string of islands that the Horde has established for adventurers and make a home on the Bleakwind Isle with assistance from the Blood Elven Reliquary to sort of establish things, get buildings set up. And in that lore, this is one of the buildings created in partnership with the Reliquary. It is owned by this lady. This is Serenray Lasari. She's a Blood Elf noblewoman and a crime lord on Murder Row. And using her connections in Silvermoon, she helped establish this new house both as a sort of respite spot to profit off the local reliquary members, and also as a new frontier for her shady dealings with closer access to Orgrimmar and also access to all the undead clients in the area. Venturing us inside, the entrance to her house is this lavish club, very private. We've got the lights down low to highlight this stage where she or others can perform. Some lovely elven style seating areas where, you sit on rugs, enjoy incense and hookah and the like. This is essentially a club for members of the Reliquary and the fancier Forsaken to enjoy themselves, enjoy some shows and some lovely food. As you can see, we have this kitchen here. So got this custom harp that I'm quite proud of. If you venture through this curtain, there's a dressing room for the performers that would, dance and sing on the stage. Out here, we enter a hallway. We've kept this area shadowed to keep it nice and secluded from this main hallway, which loops around and eventually leads to an elven chapel. So in the lore of the island, I'm saying that it's on a conflux of ley lines, and this elven chapel was built in this spot to harness the power of the local ley line, serve as a worship port. There's a vial of the Sunwell's waters poured into it. Essentially just be a place for, the light-inclined Blood Elves to worship. It's a bit odd going right from the club, but in the future this will be bumped back and we'll have more of an in space in this area. But for now, this is also serving as the very simple, quite cramped apartment for Cypher Fireheart, my Blood Knight in training. She's new to the whole knight thing, but she's got a good heart and wants to help save people, admires people like Ilaria, of course. This sort of serves as a training and worship site for her. Each room in the house either has ties as a general interstitial area or a direct connection to one of my characters, and this is basically Cypher's space. I particularly like the floating light wells that I've used, very elven in style to have these floating elements. Back here is just a rather simple armory. It has a little hidden getaway spot that you used to just be able to go to, although I think something may have broke with the pre-patch. Venturing up the stairs, however, through this side entrance, we come to a hallway, and this is the area where we will enter my future Horde part of the house, most likely. But we come around the corner to the matron's office. This is just a very classic office with a big window behind to illuminate her as she looks down upon, because there is this raised lip, any guests who might enter through the office. We've got all sorts of nice knickknacks around, magical artifacts, because she is of course a mage, an area both for planning her conquests in Murder Row and beyond, and also doing a variety of enchanting, studying, magical item creation, all that good stuff. Then a more private area for tea, where she's got this lovely plush couch for her guests all sit on stools. A lot of power play dynamics within her house in particular. In this back corner behind this bookshelf, we've just got a simple apartment bedroom. In the future, I'm going to make use of the fact that these empty stairwell rooms extend really high up to instead put a more fancy bedroom up in the sort of ceiling attic area there. But for now, this will do. The other side is rather similar in its simplicity, just a nice little bathing area, place for her to freshen up. But as we round the corner here into this shady back area, we come to, as you can tell by the torches, my Forsaken Tavern. As I said, my guild, and by extension my character roster, is largely undead, so naturally I needed a Forsaken Tavern. And you can tell this is on the second floor because I am utilizing a technique, since we don't have basements, of going up to go down to create an illusion of a basement. So we've got this nice overlooking balcony and then custom stairs that, as we venture down here, lead us to a central mosh pit before this stage, where I've put these custom instruments. We've got guitars, drums, a microphone, and custom speakers as well, all to create this very metal Forsaken rock band look, actually based off a piece of art that I did, with seating all around with various mugs filled with some sort of green ooze. It's actually a candle, but it makes for a great effect. More private booth seating back here for any secretive meetings members of the guild might want to have. And then the bar as well. This used to be more complex than an initial build, but to save budget, I pared it back. I still think it looks great though, with these cabinets, using these keg decorations alongside blight barrels to make it look like they're drinking whatever toxic, not good for humans thing is in here. And then if we go off to the side room, which has this nice bone charm, they just added these and they fit what is my Banshee's vibe so well. This is Vice's room. She is an eccentric mess of an undead elf, likes to make art out of weird objects, as you can probably tell from this entryway, and her room is based out of an abandoned mine. The general idea with the lore of this build is, as we leave the Blood Elven areas, we're sort of venturing underground and into the mountains that are on the back of the Blood Elven Palace. As this inn was built on top of a third wall mine, and then these side areas, what is my Forsaken area and what in future will be my Horde area, built in essentially the remnants of that mine, with Vice's room being a collapsed mine shaft here. Sort of a miner's office, as you can see. This raised area for her to do her monk training. She is not a paladin fan, as you can probably tell. Basic office, she doesn't really do desk stuff. She'd be much more interested in this pile of viscera, supplies for her to make her creepy art. And then a suitably chaotic, messy, just damn girl, you live like this sort of mess of a den here. But also a little, cutesy, a lot of cute hoarded objects and plushies about. More of the charms hanging from above. But she is far from the only undead who shares this space, as venturing upstairs, where we find my Tauren Death Knight's room. She is a war leader of sorts, so I use this rather large room to create a grand hall, inspired in a great part by the sort of grand halls that we see in locations like Icecrown, as well as Acheris. She forges rune weapons, so we've got this rune forge, again inspired by Acheris back here, with this anvil, all these different pieces of equipment about. And then on the right, we've got a barracks area, just tents. This is something we see in a variety of Icecrown sort of scourge areas, tents for undead soldiers, and a training area, blood scattered about, place to build abominations, and then her private sort of office slash tent here. Everything in this room is scaled to her size, so it's really funny if you come in here on, say, regular undead, they feel quite small in this space, which is meant for Tauren. This back area, a bit more Tauren inspired as well, with this sort of rug sleeping mat. Then on the other side is sort of our war planning logistics area. We've got an altar ritual obelisk at which to summon more empowered undead, various artifacts about, floating lights. A area to play a war game, chess, it can be whatever you use your imagination for. And then the actual war planning room with strategy books about, a central war planning table, this ritual circle based off how they have it in Acheris once again. But overall, this space took the most revision of any space in my build, but I really like how it turned out. Which brings me to the final area of my house. Venturing back downstairs, if we open up this secret door, We return to my forsaken Warlock's laboratory, hidden behind the apothecary bookshelves, of course, and I already went over it a little bit in this video, but I really wanted to create a sort of secret lab fail. So we've got these pipes around that route, this ooze, blight, fell from this pool to different parts of the build, powering this demonic portal that can be activated in order to make this sort of, it's meant to be an altar, but it looks almost like some odd creature arrive from there with cages to imprison any demons that she summons from the Twisting Nether using this old Legion communicator platform. She's very obsessed with both the Legion and their technology, jars of experiments, and of course in that vein, a custom Legion mech built out of a number of different pieces with a bunch of random mechanical trash around, and an implement to sort of work on it and work on various mechanical inventions over here. Of course, an alchemy circle as well for any sort of transmutations that she needs. But that is everything I've built so far, and if we go ahead and take a look at the overview of the house here, we can get a sense for the room layouts. I know this is something people have been requesting in previous videos. So our entryway is an octagon room medium, then it leads into an empty stairwell room. To its right is another empty stairwell room for our Forsaken area. I use empty stairwell rooms because they essentially allow you to get 2 rooms for the price of 1, which is a concern with the limited room placement budget. And by doing this, we're able to get another sort of medium room in companion to this, which isn't something you'd normally want to do. That's my Death Knight area, of course. And coming down to the first floor, we've got a hallway for my Banshees room, and a square room small for my Forsaken laboratory, but we are far from done with this house. In the future, with our increased budgets, I want to expand over here into making a Horde section of the house for my Horde characters, and then I also want to expand further back this direction to create a larger Blood Elven area, make the sort of chapel more isolated and more grand, get an inn going, use our beautiful skylight rooms that we have to good effect. I have so many ideas for the future, and even though we capped out on budget prior to the pre-patch, we're slowly starting to see it raised. Currently, I'm sitting at actually less than the budget prior to pre-patch because they changed the cost of some decor items that really bumped me down. But at the same time, it's not a huge amount for the spaces that I have planned to build in the future. As much as I'd like to jump right into building that new Horde section, I think it might be a good idea to get some more housing levels first. I'm currently part of the way through level 6, and unfortunately the way Blizzard has the house grind in the pre-patch, it is quite literally a grind, and it's capped one. I can only get so far month to month, so I'll be stuck at level 6 for quite a while unless I can find some big boosts and some more decor elsewhere. But we are far from done with housing because I have an alliance house still. As you can see, I've already built out an exterior, but this is honestly a placeholder. I was just testing if this idea could work, of this sort of mountaintop home, and I'm sure that I could do better. So there will be plenty more housing content coming soon, whether it's in my Horde house or my Alliance house. Thank you so much for coming along on the journey so far. I hope you enjoyed this tour. I'm planning on doing check-ins like this every 10 episodes or so if this is successful, and whatever my next build ends up being, I hope to see you there. Until then, I've been Nyx, and I'll see you next time.